What's good, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome to another episode on the channel. Part 3 of What If a Serial Killer Reincarnates in Naruto as Blind Swordsman. If you are enjoying the series, please for me like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with your friends. With that, guys, enjoy. POV Narration A. The third Raikage smiled as he read through the reports on his desk. His sharp teeth munched on some sweets, as he found out more and more about the bounty hunter he had been constantly hearing so much about. It had already been a few months since the Raikage had first heard of the red dot being in his territory. That was his actual first appearance for the shinobi world in general. Mabui, one of the jonin at the scene, did manage to give him quite a few extra details on the assassin, like his basic background, and what she managed to observe from his character. In the shinobi world, he was known as an elusive figure, but also extremely dangerous to his targets at least. When he appeared, it usually meant that someone in the area was going to die, and he had yet to fail even once in collecting the bounty that he was after. He was someone strong enough to decapitate a jonin from 100 meters away, with nothing more than a small knife. The Raikage found that fact quite impressive. A reliable assassin that worked independently of the villages and hunted down criminals that could also prove to be annoyances for said villages. The red dot was also damn near untraceable, not leaving a single footprint behind as he walked. His gait was said to be swifter than that of a cat and even more silent, a tad uncharacteristic for one with a samurai's background, but I wasn't one to judge. Still, despite his skill, running into him was not exactly an uncommon thing. The bounty hunter really didn't bother to hide from non-targets, or even from actual targets, sometimes even camping and grilling meat openly, confident that nothing could really hurt him. The Raikage remembered actually laughing out loud when first hearing about that. He could appreciate a man with such confidence. Of course, the Raikage only appreciated him because he had the strength to back his confidence. He was not a sheep, he was no innocent peddler or merchant, he was a carnivore, a true predator, one that had already consumed the lives of dozens high-profile criminals in the short span of a few months. He had no reason to hide, no one to hide from really. He could confidently stand out without any fear and without any worry. But when he truly hid, no one could sense him, no matter their rank. Sure, no cage had gone after him, but that didn't make it any less impressive. Those that did manage to run into him discovered that he was an extremely professional individual, extremely polite as well. He was basically anything that the shinobi world wasn't used to. A professional bounty hunter that wasn't a sleazy backpacker looking to score some easy money by fighting a few weak bandits. The Raikage also noticed that the assassin was smart enough to never go after any ninja related to any of the hidden villages, clearly keeping a neutral stance in their war and not caring much for it at all. It was a strategy that allowed him to freely travel around each territory, and in his profession, it was the smartest thing he could have done. Now, the Raikage actually knew the red dot by another name, Ken, a simple name, short and quite descriptive. The kanji for blade, extremely fitting for him. Now, the Raikage had already tried to recruit Ken once, but his Ambu were unable to make Ken meet with him. I was truly not offended. It was simply in line with Ken's modus operandi, always extremely careful not to take any sides or associate himself with any hidden village. And while frustrated, I couldn't quite blame the bounty hunter for his abstinence when it came to their bloody conflicts and power struggles. Still, if he is to bare his fangs at my village, I won't hesitate to fight him. Hell, it might actually be fun. Ken's epithet, or nickname, was now the red dot. He was not known by any other name publicly, and the nickname obviously came from the mask that he donned. The epithet had now earned a meaning of its own. At least going by the authors of the bingo book, think of someone's life as a sentence. A sentence always naturally ends with a black dot at the end of it. The red dot is more akin to ending a sentence that could have still continued, or putting a stop to a sentence right in the middle of it. Now, the Raikage found the nickname and description to be a bit ridiculous. All shinobi killed, after all. Not just Ken. Still, the Raikage didn't think it was wholly unfitting. Ken's way of killing was oftentimes a lot more terrifying than the methods they were used to, as most of the time, his victims would die before they even knew that they were being hunted in the first place. Sure, that was technically what all of them should have been able to do as shinobi, but actually pulling that type of thing off against high-ranked jonin constantly was not something that even the cage could boast about. Besides, the description sure was somewhat poetic in a sense, not that A was a great admirer of the literary arts. The description was likely just the bingo book writers trying to find some type of meaning in Ken's appearance or actions. He was after all an S-rank Rougenin. The S-rank was usually reserved for extremely powerful shinobi. The major villages mostly gave that rank to cage-level shinobi. There were exceptions though. A few high-level jonin and ambu with especially heinous crimes sometimes made it to S rank, but they were mostly ranked up, so they would be hunted down quicker. In Ken's case, all of the daimon of the elemental nations saw it fit to give him that rank universally in all of their bingo books. Each village also had its very own version of the bingo book. They were usually made up of high-profile targets of the village, people that put the stability of the village at risk or that harmed its interests. The bingo book that Ken seemed to be using was the one issued by the Land of Iron. His bounties were seemingly being cashed in there as well. I wonder if I can convince him to hunt down some criminals that pose a threat to our village, even if I can't get him to join me. I can at least hire his services. And the Raikage wasn't the only one thinking about things of that nature. Every nation took notice of the sudden appearance of a powerful third party, especially since they were in times of war. The red dot was brazen, confident, but most importantly, powerful and reliable. The assassin had already acted and killed enemies of just about every village. Many had already decided that they needed to either make him join or kill him. It was inevitable that some would think of assassinating him to eliminate a potential threat in case he joined another village. But killing a cage-level fighter was easier said than done. I was much of the same thought, though he decided not to outright hunt the bounty hunter down or make him a wanted criminal. Doing so seemed counterintuitive to the Raikage. For once, he felt like taking a methodical, calculated approach and simply trying to hire Ken to post a few bounties and catch his attention. Still, at that point, it became a race against the clock. Who can make the red dot join them first? And whilst that was happening, Ken wasn't exactly unaware or ignorant of the thoughts and intentions of the hidden villages. He was swiftly preparing for the future conflicts that awaited him. He was smart enough to understand that the villages would want him, and he was also smart enough to understand that some were bound to want to get rid of him. I could have collected bounties silently, sure, but disappearing criminals would have still caught everyone's attention at some point, especially since I still need to cash in the bounties besides. I've already built up my reputation. When I eventually start my organization, people will already know of me and of its authenticity. Now that Ken was expecting invites from every village possible, he decided to tone down his public appearances and BBQ parties with random shinobi. He could easily reject them constantly, but that would eventually invite the ire of some of them, which would just hasten the inevitable of assassins being sent after him. Tosho has been able to find and recruit 10 people already, but they're nowhere near strong enough to actually take on any meaningful quests. 10 people recruited in the short span of a few months was a relatively good result, especially considering the fact that Ken prohibited any and all unconventional recruitment methods like kidnapping / what he did to Tosho. Tosho was basically stuck collecting children and beggars on the street. It was a slow process, as not everyone wanted to give up their lives and join a random organization. Still, a few were willing to join after learning more about the organization itself. A bounty hunting clan, nameless still, but Tosho is already training the first batch of recruits. I really lucked out when finding him. Having him be the first blade in the organization certainly made things much easier for me. The blind swordsman sighed as he thought about the organization a bit more. I really need a proper name for this. Well, I could always just call it the Guild. I'll just think about this after the mission, I guess. Ken was currently somewhere in the Land of Earth, on the outskirts of its southern border with the Land of Grass, where the village of Kusagaka, village hidden in the grass, resided. The blind assassin slowly finished his preparations. Extremely thin metal wires were strung around trees, almost invisible to the naked eye. He made a clear path for his target, slowly but surely stalking all the way to the target's campfire. Akira, S-rank criminal and former Chunin, managed to train himself into a Jonin, pretty talented, but still a wanted man and murderer. His most recent crime is the noteworthy one though, and the one that placed him on the radar, giving him his rank, killing the Kusakage, the leader of Kusagaka. The clans in that little place put up quite a great deal of money for someone to deal with him. They even contacted me specifically. They also added a special clause, but I'll think about it after I test a few things out a bit to see if it's even possible to complete the mission properly. Ken mused in his thoughts as he silently stalked his victim, recounting as much information as he could before acting. Setting up traps was necessary, as he was dealing with someone capable of killing a cage. Granted, it was one of a weaker hidden village, and not one of the great nations, but it was still a noteworthy achievement. Being careful always paid off in his profession. If only Ken had learnt that while he was still an assassin in his past life. Had he learnt it back then he would never have been caught and executed in the first place. Ken studied the criminal, who was merely wearing civilian clothing. By what Ken could feel, there was no armor he would commonly feel on regular shinobi. Akira only had a large backpack for accessories. It seemed that he wasn't much for fashion. The backpack itself was filled with what Ken assumed were pilfered items from other shinobi. Akira was entirely unaware of the reality that was his impending demise. To him, it was a day like any other: eat, sleep, and train. He was going about his business, cooking some meat from a small rabbit that he had hunted. For a cage killer, He sure is callous. Maybe I should wake him up a bit, remind him that he isn't exactly safe tonight. Out of nowhere, Akira seemed to gulp, dropping the meat in the fire in front of him as his hands shook. A sensation washed over him, making his spine tremble slightly. He recognized it. After years as a shinobi, there was no way he couldn't have. Yet it still caught him off guard. Such an open and concentrated killing intent. Akira's head snapped in the direction from which that sensation flooded into his small camp. Looking at the forest, he couldn't spot any glowing eyes in the night. His sensory ability didn't tell him of anyone being there. The traps and strings that he had placed around the camp were also completely untouched. But it was still there, that feeling of being watched. The killing intent was also still there. He could still feel it, almost as if small knives were constantly stabbing into his skin. Then, the clouds above shifted a bit, and moonlight hit the trees around him, reflecting slightly off of a few falling leaves. Now, Akira's eyes widened instantly as he spotted the source of his fears. And he was certainly right to be afraid. A slightly vivid red blood dot shone slightly in the moonlight right in front of him, not even bothering to hide. Instead, simply staring at him. Immediately, Akira turned and ran, not stumbling one bit as he dashed off in the exact opposite direction. His instincts had been warning him to do so ever since that killing intent materialized. But only now did he decide to listen to said instincts. Why the fuck is the red dot after me? Was I too catchy when in the last village? Shit. I knew stealing from the cage was a bad idea. Ken was right behind him, walking at the perfect pace to keep up with the cage murderer. One thing was for sure though, this guy is certainly fast, probably the fastest I've met yet. Ken mused to himself as they slowly approached the traps he had set up. Akira looked behind him once, hoping to have lost the red dot, but he almost collapsed in fear when he realized that the masked man was a few meters behind him. How fucking fast is this guy? I thought there was no one faster than me besides the Raikage. Due to that carelessness, he got too close to the trap, and he felt a metal string cutting at his torso. At the speed he was going, he knew that it was impossible to avoid getting injured. With a quick hand sign, Akira's chest seemed to puff out slightly. He ignored the feeling of that metal string cut through his chest as he shot an air bullet in front of him, killing off his momentum. He rolled backwards, and immediately his leg was snagged. A rope pulled him up and hung him upside down. Akira scoffed as he quickly prepared to break himself free. But then electrified wires entangled his body, paralyzing him instantly. He struggled a bit before passing out, wrapped in what looked like a cocoon of electrified wire. Capturing people alive will always be more of a bother than outright killing them, but the reward is double. If I deliver him alive to the might as well. Ken did happen to be in need of money, as his organization was still in its beginning stages. The more they had saved up the better. Besides, not like a quick trip to Kusagaka would hurt, right? POV narration. Ken didn't waste much time in tying the man he had just knocked out. It had been easy, surprisingly so. Ken had admittedly expected to have quite a bit of trouble taking on a supposed cage killer. For such a highly valued target, he sure was a letdown, though his speed took me by surprise. It wasn't that great compared to my own. Akira's speed was greater than anything Ken had actually seen before, but it was still nothing too shocking or impressive, especially since Akira didn't seem to have anything to back up that speed. How the hell did this guy kill a cage? I would understand it if he had impressive stealth and assassination skills, but he doesn't seem to be all that special in that regard. Ken had already judged Akira's skills from what had been displayed earlier. A skilled shinobi and a trained assassin would have been a lot harder to take by surprise. Even if Ken could sneak up on them, they would be alert at all times, making sneak attacks a bit tougher. Akira was not that alert, even though he had set up a camp right outside Kusagaka's territory. To Ken, that just made the situation sound a lot worse. Perhaps interrogating him before handing him over to the grass village would be a better move. Ken then dragged Akira's unconscious body and tied him to a tree. Now, while I wait for him to wake up, might as well see what other belongings he has on him. Ken searched Akira and managed to find a few scrolls. Ones he couldn't quite read. With a sigh, Ken made a few quick hand signs, bit his finger, and pressed his palm on the ground. Summoning jutsu, his bored voice came out as a small puff of smoke appeared near his hand. The smoke cleared quickly, revealing a small turtle, lazily looking up at Ken. "What?" the turtle asked in a small, somewhat low-pitched tone. Despite its size, its wrinkly skin showed that the small turtle was quite old. At least older than Donatello Akira, who Ken had summoned before. "I need you to read some stuff for me," Ken said as he crossed his arms and tilted his head at the tiny creature in front of him. "You know we don't like reading things for you," the small turtle said as it slowly blinked a few times. Yes, you and your kind have the habit of not being particularly useful," Ken said as he waved his hand around, and the old small turtle only looked at him without any expression. "Just because not all of us are particularly literate doesn't mean you can make fun of us," the small turtle said as it hit Ken's shoe with its head. Though its actions expressed some anger or frustration, its tone and expression both remain completely blank. The fact that most of you aren't literate isn't an issue. The fact that asking for your assistance requires a large supply of fish is annoying. We have to spend quite a good chunk of cash on your annoyingly expensive services. Why can't you guys settle for fruits and berries like regular turtles? Hey, we all have our tastes, Ken. I doubt you have any fish on you, but I'll assist you for now. Since you are truly the only sage our species has ever been contracted to, I thought that was the exact reason why you don't want to do stuff for free like regular contracts would. Ken would have rolled his eyes if he had any. He didn't specifically know what a sage was, but it wasn't like the turtles were willing to answer. The turtles were the only animals that he could talk to, and almost all of the ones he had summoned had called him a sage. Upon asking them what that actually meant, most seemed to avoid answering, or outright change the subject. It all happened because of his first summon, when he had somehow managed to summon the oldest one among them. He had told him something rather interesting. Though you are one with nature, you seem to ignore its will and disregard its rules. You are not a turtle sage, nor are you a toad sage. What type of sage you are, I can't even discern. Even you don't seem aware of what you are. All the signs indicate that you are a monster far greater than I had anticipated. It was at that point that Ken's contract with the turtles had somewhat strained, with the elder one not wanting to associate with Ken at all. Thankfully, Ken was able to sway them somehow. They reached the agreement that the turtles would only help him under the pretense that they were being paid. DONATELLO Akira was the one tasked with delivering bounties, and Tosho handled the payment when he got the bounties. To Ken, it was an annoying system and a waste of resources for something that should have otherwise been free. But it was undeniable that their contract was what made his bounty-gathering journey a possibility, and therefore the building of his organization. So Ken was somewhat forced to keep them on his payroll. He also didn't have any other summons he could rely on, so he managed with what he had. The small turtle that Ken didn't bother to learn the name of read out a few things from that scroll, albeit slowly and in a bored tone, and thanks to it Ken gained a bit of perspective. The grass-style secret technique manual. The blind swordsman could somewhat guess that the scroll belonged to the Kusagaka. Did he steal it? Is this related to why the hidden village wants him alive? Ken could only speculate on that point, but it seemed to make sense. Ken undid the summoning as he pondered on a few things. He proceeded to sit down on the grass and waited for his target to wake up. Any question that I have, this man can answer. Ken waited for around 20 minutes in that stance, sitting on the ground with his legs crossed. The tall grass around him made it hard for him to be spotted from a distance, but he stood directly in front of the target, somewhat giving away his position, though he doubted anyone would manage to sense him regardless. It was normal for Ken to think about ways that enemies would be able to approach him, even though he usually allowed others to come near him. After all, having his target tied to a tree right in front of him certainly made him a bit less welcoming to visitors. After all, it wasn't specified whether or not the cage killer had any allies or accomplices, and Ken surmised that he did after judging his strength. But all of his questions were to be answered soon, as he felt Akira's breath pattern change. His heartbeat returned to a more active state. Ken smiled as he patiently waited for his prisoner to open his eyes. He waited like that for another 2 minutes, before scowling a bit. Does he think he can pretend to be asleep around me? How exactly do you plan to check your surroundings without opening your eyes? You don't seem much like a sensory type to me, Ken said as he slowly stood up. The blind swordsman then tapped his wrist, a regular katana appearing in his hand with a puff of smoke. Within the time it took for a fly to flap its wings 5 times, the blade was embedded into the tree right beside Akira's head, slightly grazing his cheek with immaculate precision. It made the captive flinch and tilt his head slightly in the other direction. After that, the jig was obviously up. The cage killer opened his eyes, sweat filling his forehead, as he stared at the masked man in front of him. It just had to be him. Akira grit his teeth at that thought. Out of everyone trying to collect his bounty, it just had to be the elusive red dot, one that had already reached legendary status in the eyes of many. His reputation, as well as his nickname, both managed to bring a question to Akira's mind, though but why hasn't he killed me yet? Ken's long and unruly hair flowed in the wind as he tilted his head slightly. I can somewhat guess what you're confused about. No one has really lived this long after facing me with the exception of the 7 swordsmen, I guess, but their clock is ticking. What do you want from me? Akira said as he struggled a bit against the ropes that bound him. I am confused. Do you even know why you are being hunted? Ken asked, his head still tilted as he grabbed his katana and placed it back into the seal on his wrist, the blade disappearing in a puff of smoke. Obviously because of my bounty. Why else would someone like you seek me out? Akira had somewhat accepted the fact that he was going to die. He wasn't about to try and beg for his life. He didn't want his last moments to look pathetic. Ken could somewhat respect that. It was certainly more respectful than the grown men he had seen cry and beg to be spared with snot dribbling all over the place. Bounty is one thing, but your crime is what granted you that bounty. Crime, obviously, because I stole that stupid fucking scroll. I was carrying it on me, So you should have it already, Akira said with a scowl. I see he's either playing dumb and trying to stall for something, or he hasn't actually killed the Kusakage. Ken pondered on that for a second, before he decided to judge Akira's reaction by giving him a bit more information. You stand accused of having killed the leader of Kusagika. What the hell are you talking about? Akira's voice sounded absolutely shocked. But Ken could feel something else. With his keen senses, Ken managed to notice the heightened heartbeat and the hair rising on the back of his neck. Akira was mostly feeling scared, hiding his fear behind a facade of bravery. This doesn't make any sense. I swear I didn't kill him. I only sneaked in and stole that scroll. An anonymous buyer was going to pay a premium for it. Akira's voice was shaking, his tone betraying his brave facade from earlier, as the reality of the situation was starting to sink in. Being hunted down as a killer was a lot worse than being hunted down as a thief. It went from potentially losing his arm to simply losing his life. Though now it somewhat made sense why someone like the Red Dot was after him. I have no reason to make this up. I do not find pleasure in belittling my targets. From your reaction, I can guess that you've been set up. Ken rubbed his chin for a few seconds as he tried to think more about how to handle the situation. For one, lying to Ken was near impossible. Unless one could perfectly control their heartbeat and body functions, lies were easy to discern for Ken. Well, that was only the case for regular people. Ken's lie detector didn't work on complete psychopaths that could lie without blinking an eye. But something told the blind swordsman that Akira was far from a master manipulator. This matter has just become a lot more troublesome than I had anticipated, though I can only blame myself. There were plenty of red flags with this situation. For a fraction of a second, the thought of simply killing Akira and collecting the bounty appeared in Ken's mind. But there was something irking him. Is this guy even a shinobi? Can I be sure of any information I had at this point? Are you a thief by profession? Ken asked as he still contemplated if getting involved in the situation further could benefit him in any way. Yeep, I've been doing it since I was a kid. Picked up a few tricks along the way. Akira smiled with a hint of pride, somewhat forgetting his possible demise for a few seconds. You're telling me this guy is self-taught? He's faster than any jonin I've faced up until now. How old are you actually? Ken said as he stroked his chin once more. His intentions were rather plain. He seems quite talented. Recruiting him might actually be a worthwhile venture. I'm 19 this year. Why are you asking me all this? Akira said as he continued to try and move while held by his bindings. I would obviously want to know more about you. This situation is quite unusual after all. The reports I had called you a former Chunin. Were you ever affiliated with any hidden village? Ken decided to continue his interrogation for the time being, though it became rather clear that basically none of the information he was given seemed to reflect reality. Akira was a bit weirded out by the line of questioning, but he was honestly glad to answer, as long as it meant he got to live a bit longer. I've never been a shinobi. Well, I did steal a few techniques from shinobi, but I was never actually taught by a hidden village. Akira's words came out as he shook his head once more. At that point, Ken was getting somewhat angry. To think they'd go as far as to trick me into hunting down a random thief and treating him like a murderer. I need to pay more attention to how I choose my targets in the future. Ken then sighed, and with a flick of the wrist, the rope binding Akira was immediately severed. Akira was scared at first when seeing the Red Dot's hand move, but he relaxed a bit when he felt the rope that bound him get cut. Unfortunately, that relaxation led to him face-planting into the dirt in front of Ken. Thanks, Akira said as he immediately stood up, still in a kneeling position as he looked up at Ken with a dumb smile on his face. Thank me later, you are still in a huge mess. Ken shook his head as he turned his head and looked around the forest. More and more people are gathering. They are quite far from here, but they've certainly spotted Akira already. Well, I'm confident that I'll be able to run away, Akira said as he slowly got up, finally standing at full height, a bit taller than Ken himself. Doubtful this place has already been surrounded, Ken said as he let his hands fall to the side, preparing to meet the newcomers that were still waiting to make their presence known. What? Akira said as he immediately became alert as well, gulping as he reached for his belt to take out a kunai, only to not feel any weapons on him at all. Ken had obviously stripped him of sharp objects, as one would usually do to a prisoner. The blind swordsman didn't see any reason to treat Akira as a prisoner though. He instead gave the thief his pouch back, allowing him to arm himself just in case. How good are you at fighting? Ken asked as he crossed his arms and continued to look around. Well, I'd say I'm average enough. Ken could only shake his head at the not-so-confident response he had gotten. Great. Let's see if these people are willing to talk things out. I'd rather avoid massacring them if possible. POV narration. Akira's hands trembled a bit as he prepared to defend himself. He figured the situation was quite dire. If the Red Dot was claiming he wouldn't be able to escape. In his anxiety, he somewhat missed the part where Ken said he wanted to avoid massacring them. So he now thought that they were going to have a difficult fight on their hands. Let's hope we can reason with them. Don't get your hopes up about diplomacy, Akira. When someone pursues you like this, it's likely they've made up their mind long before spotting you. Ken said in his usual calm and collected tone. How the hell is it so easy for him to stay calm? I'm assuming strong shinobi was sent after me, since my crime is so high profile. So even a jonin would likely be unable to escape in this situation in their history. There was never any precedent for assassinating the leader of a hidden village and getting away with it. Even if Akira didn't assassinate the Cage, he was still accused of it, which meant that his chances of survival had decreased drastically. Well, at least they were in his mind. At the very least he didn't die to Ken, right? His talent was the one thing that actually saved his life completely though, as Ken had already decided to take him in and train him. Well. If it isn't the red dot, one person stepped forward, with dozens of eyes peering into the clearing from all sides, all looking down at Ken and Akira from the cover of the trees. Their cover didn't mean anything to Ken though. The one speaking feels a bit strange, but around us, there are 10 Jonin level shinobi, around 30 Chunin. The Chunin are here just for the numbers, glorified cannon fodder. All of them seem to be adults or in their late teens, average at best. Still, their numbers meant that they weren't just random bounty hunters. That made Ken reconsider the situation for a bit, leading to a prolonged silence to set onto the clearing, as the shinobi seemed to be getting more and more anxious with each second that passed by. Silent, I guess we've caught you by surprise. Don't worry. We may spare you if you help us take care of that guy behind you. Surprise. Sorry, but you are a few decades off from being able to take me by surprise. Of course, only if your talent even allows you to grow that much, Ken said in a dead tone, not bothering to act friendly. He was willing to strike a deal if possible, but he didn't have a lot of money on him, nor was he actually willing to pay them off. Arrogant, huh? I guess your reputation did go to your head. Regardless, our mission has nothing to do with you. The strange man jumped in front of Ken, his arms moving oddly as he did so. You lot seem rather organized, not some random bounty hunters. That's for sure. You also smell like grass. You know that? Ken said as he stood in front of the Jonin. The Kusagaka got involved after all. I guess it can't be helped. They were likely tracking Akira by themselves even before I started laying down my traps. Ken was rather quick to surmise that Kusagaka had actually sent 10 teams led by Jonin after Akira. For a large village, such a move would have been rather small, but for a small village like the Kusagaka, it was a rather good chunk of their trained forces. Huh. You're certainly perceptive. Don't get involved further in this mess. It is none of your concern. We are just here to capture the one that killed our leader. The Jonin said as he extended a palm to Ken, obviously acting as if he was hoping to avoid a fight with the elusive red dot. It made sense, but something about the situation still felt off to Ken. If we take both of them on, we are certainly going to incur some losses. Why is neither of them even injured? The Jonin thought to himself as he signaled his troops to prepare for battle. Ken obviously noticed that some of them were taking their stances and preparing hand signs. He wasn't exactly pleased. As you can see, he is already with me. I assure you that I'll bring him to your village as per our agreement. That was our next destination actually, the blind swordsman said as he tapped the ground with the tip of his shoes. Ken didn't even flinch when lying, nor did his heartbeat change in any way. Even if it was unlikely that the shinobi had any ability similar to his lie detector, the blind swordsman preferred to be careful. Well, I can't notice any restraints on him. How come he even has his weapons? The Jonin said as the atmosphere around him started getting tense. I have no reason to be afraid of my prisoner. Just because he's armed, I assure you that he is no less harmless to me now than he would have been while tied to a tree. The Jonin scoffed a bit when hearing that, obviously not believing the red dot one bit. The rumors paint the red dot to be quite powerful, at least above the level of most Jonin, but he seems quite composed even in this situation. He can't truly be at the level of a Cage. The grass village was currently going through quite a few changes, but none of the people present was kept up to speed on what was truly happening. Though a sizable force, they were all tools to the village's true leaders, the clans. To them, they were only tasked with a few things. Their mission was actually rather cut and dry. Kill the one that murdered the Cage and bring his body back intact, and kill the red dot. They had managed to stalk Akira for a bit, staying a great distance away even when Ken had arrived. The plan was simple. Wait for the two of them to deal with the other. We'll pick off the straggler and complete our mission. Ken had already gained a bounty of his own in some circles, after rejecting a few invitations, and he was specifically contacted for Akira's bounty. So that this exact scenario would play out. Unfortunately, the situation shifted completely as they had all severely underestimated Ken. The blind swordsman was still unaware that he was also a target, but from the reaction of the people around him, he was getting a rather large hint. You were never willing to let either one of us walk out of here alive, were you? Ken asked as he stepped forward, standing face to face with the special shinobi as he clenched his fists. ESK. The shinobi quickly jumped back, taking out a LARGE football-sized metallic ball tied to a chain from a scroll on his belt, which seemed to be his weapon of choice. Ken simply grit his teeth as he felt all of the other shinobi around start moving as well. So it's a massacre after all. I'd advise anyone that's weak to simply leave. I don't feel like killing too many of you today. Ken decided to stop trying to reason with them as well. Instead, he started releasing his killing intent, which managed to freeze most of the shinobi in their tracks. His chakra and nature energy both flared up, and combined with his murderous intent, it ended up creating a strange and baleful aura that spread out all around him. Most of the shinobi beside the Jonin all turned completely white. The tall grass around Ken was swaying, trembling in fear as Ken's aura seemed to push it away constantly, creating a wind of its own. Ken took out his blade, slowly unsheathing it as a deadly silence spread out all around them, with most of the shinobi frozen. The only sound heard was Ken's long blade coming out of its scabbard as Ken threw the long sheath to the side with a swing. Come. That was all that Ken said. In the next instant, 4 Jonin were already onto him, with more coming behind them. They had already done quite a few hand signs while Ken was taking out his blade, and was already spitting fire towards Ken. A large wave of fire was formed as 4 different Jonin used varying fire jutsu in an attempt to kill off Ken instantly. Useless was all that they could hear as the blind swordsman's long blade cut through the wave of fire, blasting it back as the trees all around them swayed to match the raging firestorm that was coming right back at them. The Jonin managed to dodge away in time, either substituting away or entering the ground. The few Chunin that were behind them weren't quite as lucky, ending up being blown away by the wind and getting burnt by the flames. Ken was about to sigh, but he stopped himself from resting as he raised the hilt of his blade, covering the side of his face with it. A ball and chain broke through the black smoke, hitting the hilt of his blade almost instantly, bouncing away with a metallic clang, as Ken felt his hand shift, being moved by the force behind that blow. He's certainly stronger than most. He is actually a bit stronger than me as well. Ken was not delusional to think there were none stronger than him. He was still only 10 at that point, so he had a lot of room for growth. He expected to meet quite a few people better than him in many aspects, but that didn't mean he was unable to fight back against them. Akira, duck. Ken didn't resist the movement of the ball and chain, using the momentum it gave him to swing his sword behind him, where a few shinobi were already trying to ambush him. They barely had the time to react, as Ken's blade immediately became covered in the aura and released a flying slash. Akira had thankfully gotten the message and was already face-planted into the ground. The entire forest around him was cut in half, all of the smoke being blown away, and every shinobi that Akira was trying to hold off either lost a limb or was forced to retreat. The cannon fodder was the first to be incapacitated, at least a good chunk of them, as Ken had yet to feel even one of the Jonin die to him. Still, plenty of Chunin was still hanging on, hiding among the trees and waiting for an opportunity. They were after all decently powerful shinobi. Akira, run away for now, Ken said as he turned his head towards the thief who was still hugging the ground and looking at the trees falling around him. Ah yes. For a second, Akira had contemplated remaining to try and aid the blind swordsman, but he wasn't stupid. He could tell that he was holding Ken back with his presence there, so using his superior speed he immediately dashed in a random direction behind him. The Chunin had no chance of even getting close to him, as the trees around him didn't even get to fall properly, before his back disappeared into the forest. Shit. The special Jonin said as he turned and looked at a few of the Jonin around him. They immediately nodded and started dashing after Akira. Ken turned to them, swinging his blade once more, sending a flying slash in their path. This time, it seemed that the shinobi had predicted his move. 2 other Jonin and a dozen Chunin stepped in front of the flying slash, and rose 12 thick earth barriers between him and the people chasing after Akira. The walls shook as most of the people behind them were blown away, but the flying slash was still stopped effectively. Ken couldn't help but scowl a bit at the almost perfect coordination of the shinobi. Individually, they didn't really match up to him, but together they were still annoying to deal with. They can try to run after Akira, not one of them is fast enough to catch up with him. With that, Ken was left with only around 21 Chunin and 7 Jonin to deal with, including the special one. I don't remember ever making an enemy out of Kusagika, Ken said as he spun his blade with one hand at blinding speeds, and deflected dozens of projectiles with ease. Such chatter is unneeded, bounty hunter. Don't think you can just act freely in the shinobi world, one of the Jonin said as he sent another fireball Ken's way. This time, he was joined in by half of the Chunin and a few more Jonin. They formed yet another large wave of flames, much bigger than the last, spanning hundreds of meters, and burning the forest and collapsed trees in front of them without any care. Combined jutsus are more annoying than I expected. Ken only had a few milliseconds to ponder on his next move. He immediately decided on taking the obvious route of avoiding the torrent of flames, by jumping over it. He leapt far into the air, dozens of meters above the ground as he flipped with his blade a few times, batting away all of the shurikens that came near him with terrifying momentum. He spun and spun, batting away more and more projectiles, as he sent flying slashes all over the place, creating a small tornado above the raging flames. The flame torrent came and went, but the fire was still present, as the trees had already dried up and started burning with rage. Ken scowled as he realized that landing would be annoying. Thankfully, he wasn't exactly afraid of getting a bit burnt. The blind swordsman's flying slashes had cut through the cover of many shinobi, both injuring and dismembering many, including one of the jonin, who lost an arm and a leg, forcing him out of the fight among many others. Ken's momentum was almost forced to a stop as a large chain seemed to rush at him and twirl around his blade, attempting to pull him to a stop. The special jonin pulled with all of his might and dug his feet into the ground, but he could only be dragged forward by Ken's momentum. That was when a few others joined in and grabbed onto the chain, their combined force being enough to pull Ken from the air and slam him towards the ground. The masked swordsman only had enough time to let go of his sword and roll as soon as he hit the ground, dampening most of the damage, and using the momentum to roll away from yet another torrent of fireballs. Eventually, he ended up hitting his back on a burning log. He had felt it there, but he didn't really have any other path to retreat. He could feel pieces of his armor falling off, as the heat also slightly burnt his skin, but they were all small injuries, the type that he knew he could heal instantly if he so wanted. 3 short blades popped out of the wood behind him, forcing him to roll away once more, right into a torrent of kunai and a few fireballs. Ken scowled as his hands moved like lightning, forming a few hand signs and striking the ground with his palm. Earth style. Great Earth Wall Jutsu, a slightly modified version of a technique he had once stolen. A gigantic wall of earth rose in front of him instantly, blocking off the projectiles easily. Unfortunately, the techniques were harder to block. Ken could feel his wall breaking apart with each fire and earth dragon that hit it. Eventually, the combination of jutsus caused the wall to collapse entirely. The earth blew like shrapnel towards the blind swordsman, who managed to jump away in time. As he landed once more, a few earthen hands rose from the ground and grasped at his legs and torso, making him come to a halt immediately as he also slowly started to sink into the ground. Hey, even a cage would have lost to our encirclement. You fought well, but you're still no match for us, the special shinobi said as he grabbed Ken's sword and studied it with a smile. Your coordination is quite nice. I don't know about it being able to kill an actual cage, but I guess I can stop playing around now. In the first place, trying not to kill you all was a mistake on my part. Ken's voice sounded calm. Despite his situation, he didn't seem to even feel an emotion. This managed to unnerve the shinobi that had gathered around him. The special shinobi simply scowled, not affected by the atmosphere. Instead, he held onto Ken's blade and approached the currently captured blind swordsman. Going out with your own blade, a fitting end for a samurai, right? The special jonin smiled as he spoke, rising the blade above his head and preparing to decapitate Ken in one swing. The blind swordsman only sighed. The blade cut through his head with ease. Lightning spread around the sword and immediately paralyzed the special jonin as his eyes widened slightly in shock. A lightning clone. Then his eyes widened even more as he noticed a backpack filled with paper bombs right in front of him. Release, a voice was heard from behind them all as the shinobi finally noticed Ken calmly sitting on a log, his hand making a simple sign. 2 jonin quickly went to assist their leader, trying to help raise a wall between him and the bombs, but they clearly weren't going to make it. The special jonin wanted to do something as well, to make a hand sign and substitute himself, but it was far too quick for his paralyzed muscles to react. Boom, a large explosion engulfed the entire clearing their fight had created, blowing away every shinobi nearby, and killing both the special jonin and the 2 that had tried to assist him. So much for not getting involved with villages. Ken said as he felt his coat blow backwards in the wind. His armor was still missing pieces, but his body was intact. He was fully healed. Many shinobi were discouraged by that explosion, but that didn't mean they planned to stop chasing their target. 14 shinobi in total dashed at Ken all at once. The blind swordsman sighed as time seemed to slow down for him. He flexed his muscles, his skin started turning a different color as scales started appearing on it. A long tail sprouting out of his back broke the hands holding him with ease as his muscles continued to expand more and more. Veins appeared on his hands as his nails grew into shaped claws, his tails growing a large spike on the end of it at the same time. From here on out, none of you will survive. Alas, you knew what you were getting into from the start. POV narration. Akira dashed through the forest with great speed. He had been followed, but his pursuers were left in the dust, unable to keep up with him. The thief looked back a few times before he finally came to a stop and hid in a tree. What do I do now? Do I go back and try to help him out? I mean, I doubt I can do much there. It's why I ran away in the first place. But maybe I can be of more help from the sidelines. Akira was well aware that he had left Ken alone against what was essentially a small army of shinobi. Escaping 7 jonin and a few dozen chunin was not something any regular shinobi was able to do, even if the red dot was supposedly stronger than most jonin. Akira was already too far away to observe the situation, so he had decided to try and make an inventory of what he still had on him. The red dot gave me all of my shuriken and kunai back, but he kept all of my paper bombs. The thief felt like crying at that moment, as paper bombs were a lot more expensive than kunai and shuriken, and he had amassed quite a few of them to use in dire situations. Another thing that Akira realized he was missing was the scroll he had pilfered from the Kusagaka. At least I got away with my life. I'm sure the red dot can handle himself well enough. It was at that moment that Akira felt his spine tremble. He immediately jumped away from the tree, which was promptly crushed by 3 earth dragons. Shit, they were still following me. Akira quickly turned around a few times in the air, only to notice that the Jonin had already anticipated his movements. One Jonin had already completed his hand signs. He immediately started spitting flame bullets in Akira's trajectory. The thief tried to dodge, but his lack of mobility in midair made that impossible. 3 of the flame bullets hit him and exploded, sending him tumbling to the ground where another had already prepared another jutsu. Earth release. Bottomless swamp. The Jonin targeted the area where Akira was to land using a weaker version of the swamp of the underworld. It was a similar jutsu, but it only caused the target to sink. It didn't stick them to it, unlike the latter. So this was mostly just a diversion, as the last one was preparing one last jutsu to finish their target off. Akira was well aware of that. He knew that he was caught in a bad position. I got careless. Maybe I can still salvage this though. He didn't have any hopes of being able to escape. He did manage to turn in the air though, landing on his feet and trying to dash away instantly. Unfortunately, the Jonin were already expecting that, with one of them slashing him across the chest with a kunai. "You're not getting away, assassin," the Jonin said as he stood in front of Akira. The thief scowled, taking out a kunai and throwing it at the Jonin. That action had little to no effect, as the Jonin simply batted it away. Earth release. Dust storm. Akira didn't even get the time to think about his next move, as the Jonin from before was already done with his hand signs. The ground in front of the Jonin broke and shifted, creating a torrent of mud and dirt that flowed towards Akira like a river. The thief now only had one option left. Without even blinking, he disappeared from his previous position, the torrent of dirt and mud demolishing a good chunk of the forest as Akira ran in the opposite direction he had been running in previously. The Jonin smiled when seeing that, as the now injured target was forced to return towards the battlefield. They quickly gave chase though, managing to keep up with the injured Akira and tagging along right behind him. Then they all heard it. A large explosion rumbled the forest. The trees shook and the winds churned even from a distance. They could see the smoke rising from the battlefield. Akira also gulped as he realized that he couldn't quite stop and change his course, nor could he avoid the battle in front of him. I just hope the red dot managed to take care of enough of them. The Jonin had the exact opposite thoughts though. They instead hoped to see Ken dead by the time they got there. The leader should have already managed to do him in, right? What had happened on that battlefield was well beyond the expectations of either side though. As they arrived, they noticed just how destroyed the surroundings were. No tree was intact in the radius of a few hundred meters. Some parts were burnt to a crisp, other parts seemed inundated, and some had dried up and cracked earth. But that wasn't really shocking. Such a scene wasn't exactly uncommon in times of war. The more shocking part was the person that stood in the middle of the battlefield. The red dot was the only one still standing. His mask was bloodied, but the crimson dot in the middle was still very much visible. His fingers sunken deep into the neck of one of the Jonin that he had been fighting. Corpses piled up at his feet as blood pooled on the ground, dyeing it a deep red. There was no one alive. The silence was just as deafening as the explosion they had heard earlier. "Oh, you're all back. You sure took your time." Ken's voice was the one that broke the silence. It was calm, unnervingly composed for such a situation. His tone didn't shake one bit. He was speaking as if he had just finished frying some meat on the grill. The shinobi and thief all couldn't help but gulp a bit. There were many nutjobs in the shinobi world, but few were as powerful and demented as the red dot appeared to them at that moment. As they stared, they also caught a glimpse of the blind swordsman's body, as he dropped the mangled corpse of the shinobi he had been holding to the ground, adding one more to the pile. The usual red armor he had been wearing was no longer there, likely broken off during the battle. His body was only covered by a tattered cloak, loose pants and black sandals. The scariest part about that scene, the one that had massacred everyone, was completely uninjured. Not even a mark was visible on his skin. No injury or burn, despite the destruction that surrounded him. From the way things looked, it wouldn't be surprising to anyone to find out that none of the blood staining the ground belonged to Ken. It hadn't even been a full minute from that explosion, when they all figured the fight was still going on. Yet now everything was basically over. The 3 Jonin immediately thought of turning their tail and running away at full speed, knowing full well that the fight was lost at that point. Still, before running, they could at least complete one of their objectives, so that they could say they hadn't wasted all of those lives pointlessly. They immediately tried to kill Akira. The closest one to him took out a tanto and sliced towards the thief's neck, aiming to chop his head clean off. Akira took notice of that and rolled away, dodging the slash and dashing towards Ken's position. The Jonin was about to give chase, but the others behind him urged him to retreat as Ken's figure completely vanished from the middle of the battlefield. The Jonin only blinked, and all he could see was a mask, a bloodied white mask with a large red dot in the middle was all that he could see. And it also ended up being the last thing he would see as Ken's fingers dug into his chest and cleanly pulled out his heart. His hands moved swiftly then, twisting his head around and breaking it as the blind swordsman continued to dash towards the other two Jonin. Akira stopped and looked back, almost terrified, as the Jonin that had been trying to kill him a second ago had already had his neck twisted and his heart gouged out. The thief's spine trembled a bit when he saw just how quickly Ken had caught up to the other two. The Jonin tried their best, using various jutsu to try and fend off the masked killer from a flame wall to yet another bottomless swamp. But neither did anything to Ken, who simply stepped on the swamp without any issue and dashed through the fire without any regard for his own safety. Akira couldn't see what happened behind that wall of fire, but he could hear a few muffled yelps before the fire died down. Both Jonin were lying on the ground, their heads twisted, and Ken was simply walking back towards him. Akira gulped as he noticed the massive burns on Ken's abdominal region. He got a bit careless there at the end. He didn't even get to complete that thought as he noticed Ken's flesh shifting unnaturally and mending itself at a quick rate as the masked murderer continued walking towards him. What the hell? Akira was simply speechless at that point. He had never heard of a shinobi being able to instantly heal all of their wounds in that manner. And, in truth, there really were none at that point. Tsunade, who was to become a Sennin, had yet to create her technique, which could lead to similar effects. Seems you were a bit injured. Unfortunately, I don't have much knowledge of medical ninjutsu, so some bandages and salve will have to do for now. Ken spoke calmly, his voice unbothered by the smell of blood and burnt bodies that surrounded them. Akira wasn't quite as unbothered. He had seen death in the past, but he wasn't quite used to such a gruesome scene. So he was a bit too shocked and scared to speak to Ken for a few minutes, leading to a rather long pause. Ken didn't just sit around and wait during that time. He went around and looked for anything useful on the shinobi that had fallen to him. The fight hadn't lasted long after he had started taking things seriously. More specifically, he moved too fast for any of them to react accordingly while in that transform mode. Ken had also decided to give that transformation a name, as he didn't see why he wouldn't be able to consider it a fully fledged technique. Scaled Sage Mode was what he decided to call it, taking after what the turtles had called him. While in that state, the jutsu of the Jonin and Chunin were basically useless against him. The fire only served to warm him up a bit. The lighting jutsu seemed to bounce off his scales, and the earth bullets hitting him felt more like gentle taps. Jinjutsu was a joke to Ken in the first place, so no one could really do anything to him from that point forward. Kunai and Shuriken couldn't even scratch his thick scales, so the shinobi were really just sitting ducks. It was a mode that granted him overwhelming power. Ken still felt that it wasn't enough, but he wasn't exactly stressing out about it. He still had a lot of room for growth after all. That special shinobi, the one leading them all, didn't turn out to be much. He died relatively quickly. Well, whatever. At least he gave me a bit of information. I should pay the Kusagakure a visit. I'll make it clear that what happened here today is not acceptable. Set a precedent for the other hidden villages as well. After finding a few scrolls and manuals, he went back to Akira, who was sitting on a log and still looking quite shaken. "Get your head out of the gutter, Akira," Ken said as he slapped the teenager across the head. Akira was immediately taken out of his trance. The thief was certainly not used to that type of scene, but it seemed a slap did help him compose himself. "Sorry," Akira muttered as he took a better look at Ken's body. The blind swordsman was still very young. His musculature was already too pronounced for anyone to guess his age. Maybe Ken's body simply matured differently due to his mutation. Maybe it was just because of the excessive training he had been subjecting himself to from a young age. At that point, not even Ken himself had any way of knowing for sure. Still, Akira could see that muscles weren't the only aspects that were well defined on Ken's body. He was also filled with scars. It seemed the wounds that healed would still remain there for a while. Patches of skin still looked off from the burns he had received earlier, and some cuts were present here and there. You probably have a lot of questions, and you're definitely tired. But this doesn't seem like the type of place to stop and ponder things. The blind swordsman threw a few bandages on Akira's lap. The thief nodded, already treating Ken as an authoritative figure as he started treating his own wounds. Ken then went and collected his large sword, finding its sheath underneath a few fallen trees, and allowing it to disappear in a puff of smoke as he tapped its hilt on his wrist. His armed guards were still intact, so his weapon scrolls were still safe as well. "Let's go. We'll find you a cave to rest quietly. Then I'll head off to the grass village. You plan to go after them for this. You're certainly strong, but all hidden villages are prepared for invasions. I don't think this is a good idea. Akira instantly was against the idea of Ken going off to the grass village. Even if Ken somewhat scared him now, he had said those words almost instinctively. Why do you suddenly care? Ken simply tilted his head. His tone wasn't aggressive, nor was it pointed in any way. He simply seemed curious. The thief was rather flabbergasted by that question. He stopped and blinked a few times. Are you well? You did help me out. I wouldn't want the life of my savior to end so abruptly. Akira coughed a bit as he crossed his arms and looked down at the short masked man in front of him. Fair, but you don't have to worry about me. I can still escape even if I can't find an entire village by myself. The confident tone that Ken used managed to somewhat sway Akira for a second. It certainly helped that Akira had already seen Ken do something he had thought impossible. Maybe he really can just waltz into a hidden village. Well, even I was able to sneak into this one, but something tells me that the Red Dot plans to do a bit more than that. Well, the fact that I was able to go in and out unnoticed is also a bit suspicious. After what I learned today, someone inside the village likely wanted me to escape successfully. And unnoticed. Fine, we should really get moving though. I think you were right. Hanging around here can't lead to anything good. The young thief got up and dusted himself, his torso already bandaged. He clutched at his abdomen a bit inside. He quickly straightened up and dashed further into the forest. Ken followed suit, keeping up with Akira without any issues. I can't wait to have a chat with the elders of that village, the blind swordsman thought to himself as he felt the wind bend around him with every step. EOV narration. Finding shelter did not take long. There were plenty of places one could use to hide near the border of Kusagika's territory. Akira was the only one that needed rest, as Ken was neither injured nor tired from the previous fight. When it came to endurance, he was already unmatched. The thief didn't seem to have any issues with waiting for Ken in that cave, but it was made rather clear that he wouldn't be waiting for more than one day there. For one, it wasn't safe for him, a wanted criminal, to stay in one place for too long, especially since they were still relatively close to Kusagika. Now, Ken did make a good point in the fact that the hidden village was highly unlikely to send any more shinobi after Akira after 10 Jonin squads were entirely wiped out in one go. It was a relatively big blow to their overall forces. Moving that many people in the first place was likely some sort of power move. In a sense, Ken figured they were simply trying to not underestimate him and sent numerous people trained to fight together. Unfortunately, they had no way of knowing he was damn near impossible to kill, as long as he had enough nature energy around him. Simply put, Ken was constantly drawing in his energy from the surroundings subconsciously. His reserves were rather difficult to deplete. It was a bold move on their part. Going after me. The more that the blind swordsman thought about the situation, the more impressed he got. In the first place, Akira was likely nothing more than a tool they had used to draw him in. The entire conspiracy with the death of Raikage was also weird, but Ken could always just chalk that up to village politics. The clans in the village likely wanted to elect one of their own, and they saw Akira's visit as an opportunity to assassinate the Cage and blame it on someone else, subsequently also using Akira as bait to draw in the elusive Red Dot. Still, Ken was merely hypothesizing. He didn't have enough knowledge, nor did he know why Kusagika wanted Akira alive time to check things out. And as he started making his way towards the hidden village, the elders had already received a report about the failed mission. It was explicitly delivered by their most trusted shinobi, their village's Ambu captain, the strawman Saburo. He was standing on one knee, hand on his chest as he stared at the ground. His uncovered short black hair was silked backwards, the lower part of his face covered by a mask. His black eyes were completely visible, his white sclera had a strange yellowish tint to it. He was wearing dark ambi garb, regular issue. His belt strapped with a few scrolls, giving everyone the details of the situation after scouting out the battlefield. He had gone there a bit after Ken and Akira had left. He would have been able to track them, but decided against it when seeing the state of their men. EOV Saburo. There I stood, kneeling in front of the council and explaining to them the pathetic state of the team that was sent in our latest mission. All of them died, you say? The one at the head of the table spoke with disdain. His tone is annoying, but he is one of the more influential people here. The most influential elder actually. He is technically the village's new leader. The one to become Kusakage will most likely be his direct subordinate. Yes, Lord Yu. Wahara Yu. The one that spearheaded the assassination plot of our former village leader, and the one that decided it would be a good idea to try and hunt down the Red Dot. And even one of your straw clones was killed off, a Jonin one at that. One of the other elders decided to comment on my failure as well. It was my mistake to underestimate the enemy this time around. I was charged with this task, and I was the one to plan everything out essentially. I should have moved more of my clones to deal with the situation. It is shameful to have failed even after being given so many resources. Who would have thought that the Red Dot was that strong? I will recover it eventually. Your straw clones are recoverable, yet a trained shinobi are still just corpses scattered around the battlefield. These old fucks are really starting to get on my nerves. I get that I made a mistake, but most of these elders haven't done anything to help me. Either it's their fault, the most important scroll in our village got stolen in the first place. No, more specifically, it's all the fault of Lord Yu whatever he's planning. It's starting to look less and less like it will do any good for our village. How regrettable indeed. However, we should still be able to train more. Newer generations are born each year. I can at least try to reassure the elders a bit, even if most of them don't seem too convinced. ESK. If this keeps on, we will never enter the ranks of the 5 great hidden villages. Another clan leader spoke up, one of the minor clans in the area. His clan has only recently attained some wealth, and now he has the gall to come here and run his mouth. Someone like him has no clue just how much power the 5 great villages hold. Ignorant old fuck now gentlemen. Thankfully, Lord Yu is still here to hold everything together. It is true that we are facing a rather unexpected conundrum, but our village is not in any danger as of right now, indeed. Lord Yu, while we have suffered some losses, we have also learnt more about our enemy. I believe the red dot was still injured quite a bit during that altercation, so I at least have some understanding of his strength, though I was unable to see the rest of the fight after my straw clone was killed off. I remember the red dot was burnt quite severely during that fight, while my clone was still there. And by the way, things looked when I visited the battlefield. He probably received quite a few injuries, even after my clone died, quote. I guess he isn't quite up there with the 5 Cage, as some rumors portrayed him then. A great thing to point out, Lord Yu. Not like our village could afford to face off or offend a cage in its current state. The only jonin that are capable enough to survive an attack from an actual cage are mostly indisposed at the moment. Not like we have more than 4 anyway. The former Kusakage was decently powerful, about as powerful as I am with all of my clones, but he was nowhere close to matching up to people like the 3rd Hokage or the 3rd Raikage. The 5 great villages are the places where the real monsters are born and thrive. They actually have several figures at the level of an actual cage. Konohagaka currently has the White Fang, for example, and the Kumogaka has the sons of the current Raikage, who I heard are quite formidable, all of them learning the lightning release chakra mode. All of the large villages also have several Jinchuriki, which makes the power balance even more skewed. It's basically impossible for a village like ours to match up to them, yet the elders here are still dreaming about useless stuff like that. At least Lord Yu is more realistic, and is only trying to profit for himself in these situations. After all, a small village like ours will get killed off, if even one of these cage-level figures was to be tasked with its destruction. And while I can fend off most attacks by myself with my clones, I am bound to lose a lot of them against an actual cage. I'd likely just have to flee. The village would still be doomed. It's no use for us to try and compete with the 5 villages. It's much better to just suck up to them. This is why I can understand Lord Yu's attempt at assassinating the Red Dot. One of the 5 villages seemed to be rather keen to see him dead. If we were able to claim his bounty, things would have been looking up for us. Well, I'll now have to look into killing the Red Dot myself after this meeting. I'm sure I can still track him, and with all of my clones, it should be rather simple to kill him as he is still injured. All in all, this village is lucky that I am still on their side. Yet, I still have to put up with the bullshit of these stupid elders. Alas, they are also the ones to provide me with enough people to perform my rituals on. They are the most accommodating, and ask the least questions, so I can't complain now, can I? Well, I guess this gives our village some time to recuperate still. An assassin like him will certainly come after our heads. Once he does recover, another elder just felt the need to add that. Couldn't have had a more positive atmosphere after all. I guess Lord Yu will always have his detractors. It can't be helped, though I'm guessing they won't be alive for very long if they're willing to voice out dissatisfactions like this. I doubt we need to worry. A barrier will tell us whenever anyone gets too close to the village, no matter how well they can hide their presence. We will be able to prepare ourselves accordingly. We still have the home field advantage after all. That is also true. This being our territory means we know it better than any outsider. The Red Dot isn't as big of a threat here, especially since he'll be detected when he gets too close anyway. The barrier surrounding our village is made with advanced Fuinjitus. The only reason such a thing is available to us is that we managed to befriend the Leaf Village during the reign of their 2nd Hokage. No matter how good the Red Dot is, he won't be able to overcome something set up by Fuinjutsu masters back in the day, right? EOV narration: there were plenty of people stationed inside the array room of the largest building in Kusagaka, jonin that were there to both protect the array/formation and to watch over it. A large glowing map stood in the middle of the room. A large transparent circle surrounded it, the layer that made up their formation. The core was in that very room, and the transparent circle would ripple every time someone with a certain level of chakra passed through. One would only be able to not trigger the alarm by carrying a specific seal while passing through it. That seal was usually hidden in their headbands, so all of their shinobi was safe to pass through. Each rank of shinobi was given a different seal, as the formation reacted differently to the amount of chakra a person could have. Their defenses were quite good and their secrets were well kept, so they had nothing to worry about. They also didn't have to worry about not noticing something, as the ripples in the array were large even when an unrecognized genin passed through it. There was no way for any such action to go unnoticed. Ken stepped into their territory without making any noise, his legs touching the grass soundlessly and weightlessly. He stopped just short of a small line in the tall grass in front of him, 1 centimeter of earth where there was no blade of grass, a line that likely surrounded the entire village. It was impossible to notice with the naked eye, but someone like Ken could sense it regardless. He felt the formation in front of him. He had already expected something like that from a hidden village, so he wasn't exactly shocked. Ken's knowledge of seals and formations was not that great, but he was aware of what could be achieved using them, thanks to some scrolls he found, including the weapon storage seals he was using. To him, seals were an extremely complex and amazing art. It was something he absolutely wished to master if given the chance. Thinking logically, he started theorizing about how the formation worked. If a regular shinobi's thought process is anything to go by, this formation is likely just an alarm system. If it triggered every time a regular person passed through, it would be very messy. So this is likely only here to detect actual threats. People with a certain level of chakra. How it goes around not constantly detecting their own shinobi is something I can only guess right now. This doesn't feel all that complex though, at least nowhere near as much as I expected. Ken simply tilted his head at that thought. After all, if that was truly the case, then the formation was truly quite flawed. Not the type of work he'd expect from trained master assassins. But he was not attacking any large village at the end of the day. This was just a small village, quite weak in the grand scheme of things. I guess I can try to go in undetected. With a deep breath, Ken's form started shifting once more, his skin visibly turning to scales as he pushed out all of the chakra in his body. I don't know if they can detect nature energy. I've yet to meet someone else using it, so I'll just hazard a guess that they can't detect it as easily. Ken used his tail to dig up a small hole, creating a small hill right near the barrier's edge. And so, Ken walked up in front of the barrier and sat down on that small dirt mound, sitting on his side with his tail wrapped around his body. I didn't think I'd be doing something like this to get into a hidden village. Undetected, Ken pushed out the small remainder of his chakra, next turning into a statue, that next instant instantly becoming petrified and rolling off into the formation. Inside the array room, the jonin in charge yawned as he kept his eyes fixed upon the translucent barrier around their large map. Not one ripple appeared as Ken's statue rolled through their barrier and into their territory. It was as if someone had just thrown a rock towards their village, which didn't trigger any response from their barrier. The blind swordsman stayed as a statue for a few minutes. Cracks started appearing on the surface as soon as he started regaining some chakra. Ken then proceeded to crawl further away from the array, his tail slithering behind him as he slowly stood up. I wonder if this formation helps them keep watch on who is inside it as well. Well, I've done whatever I could to come in undetected at this point. If they have further countermeasures, then I'll just have to deal with them as they come. Ken then turned back into his regular form, still controlling his body and suppressing his chakra to the maximum as he walked through the tall grass, while not disturbing it in any meaningful way. Time to see what this village is truly made out of. I'll try to avoid harming any of the civilians here. I just hope the other shinobi have similar thoughts. POV narration. Ken blended into the shadows, his black cloak covering his body, his white mask being the only thing that was standing out. But he was smart enough to keep away from anyone capable of spotting him. He crept into the shadows, flying past their village's small walls with a single leap. Since they've not intercepted me yet, I can safely assume they have no way of tracking me if I didn't trigger the alarm. With that, Ken became a lot more confident, knowing that he otherwise could hardly be noticed by sensor types. He glided through the night, dashing from wall to wall, and getting closer and closer to the largest building in the village, the Cage building. Before heading there, however, Ken scouted out the village a bit more, looking for other areas of interest and checking if anything valuable was there. Funds were always an issue, so finding money was not a bad thing. Ken managed to successfully borrow some money, jewelry, and scrolls from the clans in the village. It was surprisingly a lot more than he had managed to gather through his bounty hunting over the past few months. Damn, making enemies out of a hidden village isn't nice, but they sure have money to spare. The security was surprisingly lax, at least for someone like Ken. But it seemed that wasn't the case for the entire village. More specifically, all of the shinobi seemed to be guarding the Cage building, where Ken assumed a meeting with all of the important people in the village was taking place. The closer he got to the Cage building, the tighter the security was around him, and the more questions appeared in his head. How the hell did Akira even get close to that building? It was obvious at that point that Akira was likely just allowed to stroll in there. Even Ken was having issues sneaking around all of that security. Akira shouldn't even have been able to get close to the village without getting spotted. Now, the majority of patrolling shinobi were merely genin and chunin, but that didn't mean they didn't have eyes. The cage building had no blind spots from what Ken could feel. It somewhat made sense for a hidden village to be that well guarded, but that didn't mean Ken had to like it. I can't just sneak in there by the looks of it. Too many eyes on all entrances, even windows on the higher stories. It's impossible to not get spotted if I do try something. A meeting is certainly going on in there from what I can sense. Wait, isn't that the leader of the team sent after me and Akira? Ken could sense his signature, Subiro's signature to be more exact. And Ken remembered quite clearly that there were just a few chunks of flesh left of him. If it was a clone, then there shouldn't have been anything left of it. It's pretty weird. A lot of people feel like him nearby. I should probably look into this. Ken then decided to look for some type of disguise to get inside quietly. He could always just attack it, but that was likely going to affect quite a few of the civilians inside the village. If I can get in there, I'll just force the entire fight to happen inside. I doubt they'll be willing to destroy that building anyway, so it should be fine. Ken went around a few buildings for the following minutes, keeping an ear on the pulse of the situation, keeping track of the people around him, and trying to decide who would be the best disguise. In the end, he managed to spot a masked figure, wearing a cloak similar to his own, probably of the same color as Shinobi didn't like standing out. The blind swordsman immediately assumed that the man was an Anbu. It wasn't exactly a difficult conclusion to come to. It seemed that he was the most obvious choice at the end of the day. Ken only needed to transform himself slightly to match the other person's hair. There was one issue though. What color is his hair color, I wonder? It wasn't like the wind beating in his ears was going to whisper the colors of things around him. He also couldn't just summon a turtle to help, as it was bound to give away his position. Alas, it doesn't have to be the perfect disguise. I just need to get in unbothered. I must only fool a few people, not the entire village. Ken stalked that masked man a bit. It seemed that he was also heading for the building that housed the Grass Council. He was able to successfully predict the Anbu's trajectory and rushed into an alley in front of him. The Anbu jumped from building to building without noticing anything awry. He had no clue that he was being tracked. And when he jumped over a certain alleyway, he felt something grab his leg, stopping him instantly. He looked down at his foot only to notice a clawed hand covered in dark scales clutching his leg tightly. He was about to scream, but a tail immediately clutched his neck tightly and dragged him down. Ken dropped into the alleyway, his tail crushing the Anbu's neck as he landed. The blind swordsman wasted no time in taking off his mask and coat, putting them in the seal on his wrist. He then took the dead Anbu's mask and coat, putting them on quickly. He judged the other man's haircut for a moment, and used the transformation jutsu to minimally alter the size of his hair. He didn't bother altering the color, as there was no point in trying to guess it. They were also of similar size, so Ken didn't need to bother with altering his height or build in any way. It was a lot better like that. The lesser transformation changed, the harder it was to spot at the end of the day. Ken then contemplated what to do with the body, before sighing and taking out a scroll from the seal on his wrist. I can't leave this here. It's one good way of raising the alarm and allowing things to go to shit. Thankfully, it didn't take long to put the body in the scroll and store the scroll back into his wrist. Ken then continued the Anbu's journey, not bothering to hide his presence as much, and allowing quite a bit of chakra to be felt from him. He tried his best to match the other man's chakra levels, which was a bit above most chunin by the feel of it, but not quite close to being a jonin. The blind swordsman continued on the Anbu's path. He could tell that he was spotted by quite a few people, but it seemed that his disguise had done its job. Ken managed to enter the building without anyone stopping him, which was a great success in his mind. Wait a moment. Ken froze in place, a few steps from the doorway, when he heard a voice call out to him. Reindeer, are you already reporting? How was your patrol? Another Anbu stood there, looking at him through his mask. Ken pondered on how to answer for a few seconds. He didn't know what voice he could use, and he didn't know if Reindeer was even his codename. Is he testing me? If that's the case, then I should prepare to kill him quickly. Ken waited for a few seconds, pondering whether or not to try and keep up his disguise using a rough voice. That was when the Anbu in front of him made a small mistake, showing a slight tint of hostility. Ken immediately picked up on that and noticed that the man was on high alert. Shit, my cover's been blown already. Immediately he stepped toward the Anbu, who only got to take a step back, as Ken's hand was covered in scales and impaled his chest. The blind swordsman had aimed for the heart, alas. Thanks to his alert state of mind, the shinobi was able to slightly shift his body and avoid getting his heart gouged out. Ken then turned around, claws still digging into the man's lung, and kicked the Anbu's face with unrelenting force. His body bent at an odd angle as he did so. The Anbu's mask seemed to crack as he vanished in a puff of smoke. Ken felt him fleeing, swapping places with a log as Ken's clawed hand embedded itself into the log as well. The substitution was far from successful though, as the Anbu had still been severely injured. Ken then proceeded to throw the log outside using all of the speed he could muster, causing it to fly like a bullet right into a few shinobi right before it exploded. Explosive tags at the ready, he was preparing to attack me. Good thing I acted first. Ken then proceeded to return his body to normal, allowing his chakra to recover as he started rushing towards the meeting room. He ran through the hallways. A few Anbu tried stopping him. This time Ken took out a katana to deal with them, cutting through their limbs. Before they even got to finish performing any jutsu, they were left with missing limbs on the ground, as Ken didn't even stop to finish them off properly. Ken immediately hid his presence and threw off his Anbu mask. He could feel all of the shinobi in the village mobilizing, but he knew that they hadn't spotted him. He had the time to put his own mask back on and change back into his usual cloak. The people in the conference room were already aware of what was happening outside. It seemed that the commotion had already alerted them of an intruder. All of the people inside, bar the elders that represented the villagers, were already up from their seats, with their hand signs finished, prepared to unleash a flurry of jutsu at the door. Ken could feel that some of the people inside were above most jonin in strength. They were likely the heads of the few clans that resided in the grass village. The blind swordsman wasn't at all discouraged by the surplus of people inside, but he wasn't about to just walk in front of their jutsus. There were also plenty of other people inside, Anbu hiding in the room and protecting the elders. Coming through the door was not a good move in that situation, so Ken instead went to an adjacent room that shared a wall with the meeting room and took out his blade. He grasped his large blade with both of his hands, swinging it and severing the wall in front of him. A flying slash extended and killed most of the people near that wall. The others in the room seemed to have the time to duck, but Ken's surprise attack did manage to kill 3 elders. Through the dust of the destroyed wall, everyone in the room caught a glimpse of Ken's mask, making their spines shudder. A famed bounty hunter coming after their heads. It was a bit absurd for him to attack an entire village alone, but seeing his 3 elders were already dead sufficient to say, Ken certainly had the skill to kill them even in that situation. Saburo was just as shocked to see the red dot, but he wasn't afraid. All of his clones were nearby after all now. The strawman gave a command instantly, and Anbu dropped from the ceiling, all unleashing a flurry of flame and water towards Ken. The remaining elders also did the same, with only one of them doing something other than a fireball, wind bullet or water wave. Grass style. Grasping rosebush, the elder tapped the floor with his hand, a loud thud resounding throughout the large room as Ken felt the floor underneath him creak. The blind swordsman moved instantly, dodging a few jutsu as he did, and tried to rush towards some of the other elders in the room, only for a few tendrils to rise from the floor in front of him and stop him in his tracks. Ken was about to cut through the rose thorns in front of him, but then his legs were also rooted in place as the bush rose from the ground and entangled his feet. Spiked tendrils rose from the ground and dug into Ken's legs, forcing him in place as he turned to the attacks coming his way, preparing to at least block the jutsus coming his way. Grass style. I guess the founding clan of this village has that Kekkei Genkai. What an annoying bunch. Ken spun his blade in front of him at great speeds, creating a whirlwind in front of him as he did his best to cancel out the attacks coming his way. It seemed to work for the most part. The majority of flames that came in contact with the spinning blade seemed to get dispersed. The blind swordsman could, however, feel his arms getting more and more burnt as more fire came his way. Each wind bullet slowed him down slightly, and each water jet seemed to force him back a bit as the thorns in his legs still ripped at his flesh. But Ken was able to hold on perfectly. The pain was nothing to him, and the injuries were still negligible. Eventually, 2 large dragons came his way, one made out of fire, and another made out of earth. Ken's blade wasn't able to turn and cut them in time, so the blind swordsman was hit head-on. The blind swordsman dug his feet into the ground and prepared to block the earth dragon with his blade, keeping it in front of him and bracing for impact. The earth dragon immediately crashed into him, causing him to skid backwards a few meters before coming to a stop. It managed to rip the thorns that had been keeping him in place and injured his legs even more. The fire dragon came in right after. Ken turned and managed to only get halfway through a swing as the dragon came in. The blind swordsman only got to shift his body to the side slightly, only losing his arm to the gigantic fire dragon. Ken wasn't at all panicked though, as he allowed his legs to heal already, and the thorns that had been stuck in him fell to the ground. It was impossible to tell if Ken's legs were healed because of the sheer amount of blood pooling at his feet. The blind swordsman also cut off the burnt off parts of his now charcoal arm that still remained on his body in order to properly heal it later. To be expected of a hidden village. Huh? Decisive enough to destroy their own buildings to kill me. Interesting. I didn't think you would have the guts to come to us directly. You were already injured enough. Saburo walked forward, and the Anbu around him followed in an almost mechanical manner. You're the interesting one here. Say, have I killed you before? Ken asked as he stood straight without even a hint of fear. The Anbu caption found the red dot's endurance to be quite impressive, even shocking. But the result of the fight was still clear in his eyes. You did kill one of my clones. They are a bit special, as I'm sure you've realized. Not that any of this matters to you. You're still going to die here. Saburo shrugged a bit as he signaled to the Anbu behind him. It feels quite weird. Are all of these Anbu also your clones? Ken really struggled to understand the jutsu that Saburo was using for a moment. but he was still sharp enough to notice that. The Ambu all seemed to have different chakra reserves. It was rather odd. Ken felt as if he was sensing different versions of the same person instead of clones. You sure are chatty for a corpse. Saburo then raised his hand, and the clones behind him all prepared one last jutsu to finish off the elusive red dot. I guess I wanted to test the waters a bit. My bad for underestimating you all. Ken's body then slowly shifted underneath his cloak. His muscles expanded as his body once again filled with scales. Saburo's eyes widened in horror as he watched Ken's previously missing hand reappear, veins bludging on his muscles, as the arm just reappeared into existence. I hope you have a few aces hidden up your sleeve, otherwise you are all going to die here. Ken grasped his blade in one hand, wielding it effortlessly, as his other hand grew a sharp set of claws. EOV narration. How can someone heal so quickly? Saburo and the elders that had witnessed that scene were all flabbergasted, but they weren't scared, at least not yet. All of the shinobi in the village were already gathering towards the cage building, so it didn't matter how fast Ken could heal, he'd still die at the end of the day. But those scales are unnerving. Something tells me that I should at least flee with my main body. Saburo's instincts were a bit better though. He could feel his spine shudder at the sight of Ken's transformation. He could also feel the aura in the room had become a lot more suffocating. That type of pressure would definitely make it harder for less experienced shinobi to concentrate. He could feel everything that his straw clones were feeling, so he felt Ken's aura a lot better than most would. He could also see Ken from every angle essentially, but that didn't make him any more ready for what was to come. The red dot started moving at speeds that simply couldn't be tracked by any regular shinobi. The strawman could only sweat as he watched 4 of his straw clones lose their heads instantly. Ken stopped and touched one of the heads of the dead clones. His claws dug a bit into it, and he shook it after noticing something strange. A layer of straw seemed to fall apart and revealed the head of a completely different man, possibly a former shinobi. Interesting. Some sort of possession and transformation technique. I can safely assume that not one of the people in front of me is the real one, as they all feel the same. Your technique seems a bit sadistic, the blind swordsman said, slowly turning his head towards the strawman's clones. It is a cutthroat world. No one has any right to judge me, you especially, one of Saburo's clones said as it looked at Ken's scaled body with visible fear. Oh, I wasn't judging you. Ken stepped on the floor heavily, fracturing it and causing a lot of it to fly from the sheer force of his step. The blind swordsman appeared in front of that clone, his clawed hand digging through its head with ease. It was just an observation. I would also call it quite impressive, Ken said as he looked at one of Saburo's clones that was trying to stab him with a tanto. The blade snapped completely when coming in contact with the blind swordsman's back. Saburo's eyes widened, and he gulped a bit as he responded. That is high praise coming from somebody like you, fuck's sake. The only one I know of that may be able to fight this monster is the Raikage. Maybe some of the other 5 cages of the large villages could, but this small village is doomed. Saburo had already completely given up on the grass village. The other elders were still willing to fight though, grass style. Overgrown weeds. The floor underneath Ken seemed to shift, and grass started growing out of it uncontrollably. The blind swordsman jumped and grabbed onto the ceiling, digging his tail into it to avoid the attack that tried to grab and entangle his entire body. The grass seemed to keep growing, expanding toward him regardless of his elevation, so Ken was forced to his tail to push himself into a different part of the meeting room. He spun in the air, and a few of Saburo's clones managed to get out of the way, allowing Ken's tail to cleave through one of the elders, the other one substituting with a wooden log in time. There were now only 3 elders left. Saburo's clones were still numerous, but Ken wasn't exactly afraid of them. Yu, the strongest and most influential elder, was still willing to fight with his life on the line, despite the clear difference in skill. He won't be able to keep up that form for long. Whittle him down, keep him here until the others arrive. The elder shouted with authority in his voice, waking up the others around him and rallying them again. Yu then tried to perform another grass-style jutsu, hoping to at least distract the monstrous bounty hunter that was bent on slaughtering them all. Shit, I need to escape by myself at the very least. As long as I live, our village does as well. The influential elder looked around as he watched Ken cut through Saburo's clones with ease, dried up body parts flying throughout the room as the carnage continued. We can't fight him in an enclosed space. The other 2 elders looked at each other, quickly performing a few hand signs and finishing their jutsu and tapping on the ground. Doten, Rikiju Shoujukiha no Jutsu, Earth Release, Ground Shockwave Technique. Their combination made it feel as if an earthquake was breaking through the entire building. The floor, made out of wood and dirt, was deformed, and everyone was forced to jump from one piece of rubble to another as the building fell apart right underneath them. Anyone that had been on the lower levels was doomed to be crushed by the debris, but the elders didn't seem to particularly care. All of the shinobi of their village were already gathered around the collapsed cage building, and the elders were the first ones to jump out of the rubble and stand amongst them. Good, let's show this bounty hunter why you must never mess with a hidden village. Yu was a bit mad that the other elders had acted without consulting him and destroyed the building. but he was glad to be amongst the other shinobi of their village. The strawman also jumped out of the collapsed building in time, along with a few clones. He stared at the collapsed building with a scowl on his face. Well, on most of his faces. As if that's going to injure him. I already tried stabbing him with every weapon in this stupid village. My clones weren't even able to put a scratch on his scales as Saburo had expected. The next person to come out of the rubble was Ken. All of the shinobi present shuddered when they saw the rubble being blown apart in all directions. Ken walked out of it uninjured and uncaring. His masked face was simply facing everyone without even flinching. He let his long sword sink into the ground, tilting his head slightly, as he seemingly glared at all of the shinobi through his mask. Not that Ken could glare at anyone per se, but they didn't have any way of knowing that, now did they? All of the shinobi presents were looking at him with sneers and cursing at him loudly, asking how he had dared to attack a village by himself. The three eldest still alive also helped rile everyone on as they added to the fire, by promising great rewards for the one to bring down the red dot. Saburo scowled when seeing that. He was the only one smart enough to know that there was really no winning in that situation. Even if we managed to beat him, many people are bound to die here today. The standing of this hidden village will fall exponentially, and it will likely just be swallowed by another one. The strawman ultimately couldn't care less about the village itself, but he would be forced to look for a new hideout. And right when my supply of clones is going down the shitter, Saburo couldn't help but curse under his breath. All of you are noisy, would you mind shutting up a bit? The blind monster tilted his head as he spoke. The same baleful aura from earlier spread throughout the battlefield, unnerving all of the people present. It didn't get a large reaction out of trained shinobi, but it was at least enough to make them quiet. You were the ones that decided to make an enemy out of me in the first place. You can only blame yourselves for all that will happen today. Ken's voice reverberated throughout the clearing created by the collapsed cage building. Big words for someone that's surrounded. Do you think you have what it takes to escape from here? Elder Yu said with a cocky smile on his face, his eyes narrowing at Ken's appearance. He is a lot stronger than the reports say. No one said anything about scales either. It's good that everyone got here quickly, or I might have gotten killed earlier. Although cocky on the outside, he was quite worried inwardly. Their lack of understanding when it came to the red dot's abilities was the main cause of that worry. It couldn't be helped, after all. They had just watched Ken kill quite a few of Saburo's clones with ease, and most of the clan leaders in the village were also dead. Escaping isn't a problem. I'll leave when I feel I've done enough to send a message. Ken's tail swayed a bit, the spiked end trailing on the ground a bit, and cutting through it with ease. Some of the shinobi presents couldn't help but flinch, but they were all prepared for a fight, and they decided to rush in at the same time. Ken also took off, the debris underneath him breaking instantly, as Ken dashed in between the shinobi. Saburo sweated a bit when he saw that. Leaving his blade behind, he's not even using Kenjutsu. This means he's not even taking this seriously. This village is well and truly doomed. Saburo sneakily sent some of his stronger clones away. No use losing more of my strength on this village. I'll just pretend to help them a bit, then flee then. Saburo and the weaker clones that remained all dashed in as well, preparing for a harsh battle. Might as well say goodbye to the rest of my clones. I want to at least try and damage him slightly, repay this stupid village a bit for all of the test subjects they provided. Unfortunately, the Taijutsu bout didn't go exactly as the grass shinobi had planned, as Ken's tail and claws cleaved through their weapons with ease. Ken swung his claws at a shinobi, cleaving him in two, while 3 blades broke on his back, cutting into his cloak and shredding it further. The shinobi was simply flabbergasted, looking at their broken weapons with scared eyes, only for 2 of them to be decapitated by a tail swipe. The third one managed to crouch in time and avoid losing his head, but Ken's leg whipped out and kicked him square in the chest. The shinobi immediately felt his ribs shattering into fragments and shooting into his lungs. He was sent flying into the crowd, half dead. As that was happening, more and more people gathered around Ken, stabbing at him with spears and all types of weaponry, trying to score in more and more hits, and whittle him down, as instructed by the elders. Ken turned and grabbed 2 of the spears, using his superior strength. He yanked them out of the hands of their wielders. He then grabbed both of them with one hand, slightly crushing the wooden parts of both, as he started swinging them around madly, cutting into the shinobi with extended reach. Many fell to his swings, while their weapons barely left a scratch on him. One lucky shinobi managed to attack him with a weapon covered in lightning chakra. It left a red line across the red dot's back. The shinobi wasn't lucky enough to escape though. His head was pierced through by Ken's tail at blinding speeds, and the wound he had created was nothing more than a scratch that healed up in seconds. At that point, many realized that getting close to Ken wasn't optimal, so they started bombarding him with kunai, shuriken and senbo. They didn't seem to be that effective on the blind monster's scales, harmlessly bouncing off as more and more weapons pulled at his feet. Some tried to aim for his eyes, but Ken made sure to shield his mask, so in the end they weren't able to do much. Ken smiled a bit as he felt the weapons pull at his feet. He immediately blasted his tail into the ground, causing hundreds of kunai and shuriken to slingshot back at the shinobi. More started falling, being pierced by weapons as fear spread throughout the battlefield. Some tried spitting fire at Ken, but the fire seemed to be ineffective. Wind bullets also didn't even seem to make him flinch. Useless fools. They're just like a bunch of cattle waiting to be slaughtered, can't adapt to their opponent at all. All of them would have been more useful as clones. Elder Yu scowled when he saw the way things were moving. He immediately started commanding everyone in a more direct manner, taking control of the situation and spouting orders loudly. He tried grasping Ken in grass, but the blind monster was able to just rip them out of the ground with ease and continue throwing back kunai and shuriken with his tail. Saburo also scorned them loudly as he instructed all of his remaining clones to scatter and encircle Ken. He immediately started setting up paper bombs and throwing them towards Ken. Ken felt them coming and immediately swung his tail and spun around in a circular motion, bouncing dozens of explosive kunai back towards the crowd. Just as they started glowing, explosions rang all around Ken, and he scowled a bit at the way they overloaded his senses. The charred smell of burnt-up bodies and the ringing of the explosions managed to blind his senses momentarily. But he didn't panic at all. He could still easily feel the way that people moved around him, the way their auras manifested. From the way they were revolving, it seemed that they had created a larger clearing around him, clearly preparing for a large-scale combination jutsu of sorts. They're probably taking the opportunity of me being a bit stunted to prepare something big. I don't really have chakra to perform any jutsu to defend myself in this form, so I guess I'll just have to tank it. Ken then slapped his tail on the ground, creating a shockwave large enough that all of the smoke around him was blown away, revealing all of the blown-up body parts and burnt corpses that littered the scorched ground surrounding him. I can't go and heal from large wounds constantly. Regrowing my arm was enough to tire me out. I'm still far from being able to recover from such wounds at no cost. It might be time to flee from this place soon, alas. The damage was already done. In that short bout, the village had lost at least 100 able-bodied shinobi of different ranks. Meanwhile, Ken was just tired. He had his scales to thank for that, as he would have been dead had he tried to take on that many people in his base form. He was only able to ignore hits and fight recklessly because he knew that he was durable. If he needed to dodge around constantly, then the damage he could have dealt would have been far less. The shinobi around him seemed to have already prepared something nice for him, and Ken turned and smiled a bit under his cracked mask. Fire Release Corporation Technique. Garuda. Dozens of shinobi finished their seals and started spitting out gouts of fire. The breaths of many combined into only a few gigantic flame dragons. Ken felt that he was surrounded on all sides, but he didn't panic. Instead, he punched at the ground with all of his force, causing the earth around him to crack and raise up, creating a makeshift shield around him just as the dragons were about to reach him. The combination jutsu blasted apart earth around Ken, but it wasn't like he was forced to take the hit. The blind swordsman used the few seconds that the earth's shield had bought him to jump over the fire dragons, avoiding the raging explosions with ease. One of the dragons followed him in the air, but Ken managed to cut it apart with a swing of his tail, using the momentum of his jump and spinning around fast enough to cut through anything that came close to him. He could feel more of his cloak burn up and some small bits of his mask falling apart as it broke further. It was only around his mouth though, and Ken wasn't worried much about it, as he could still fix it. Still, the high temperatures did boil the blood in his veins and heat up his organs, making him use more and more energy to heal up. He was constantly absorbing nature's energy, but that didn't mean he wasn't going to run out eventually. His consumption at that point was far greater than his absorption, so he had to be careful. But he was still relatively safe. He then landed on the ground with a loud thud, slapping it with his tail a few times, and blasting away the fire that was around him. Ninja art. 4 flames formation. Just as Ken landed, the shinobi acted once more. 4 Ambu tapped their hands on the ground simultaneously, and a violet, slightly transparent barrier spread out all around them, entrapping Ken in a large formation. Oh, a prison of sorts, how thoughtful, giving me time to rest. Ken laughed a bit at their struggle. He was already planning on fleeing, as he felt he had already done more than enough damage, and he didn't feel like he could keep up much longer. The shinobi didn't seem to be in any mood to joke around anymore. Any mocking laughter or gaze was completely gone. They were all desperate, tired and scared from what Ken could feel. So his attack had already met its intended purpose. Most of the fight was kept in the clearing of the collapsed cage building, so no civilians were affected at the very least. More like giving us some time to rest. One other person was there in the formation with him, one of Saburo's clones, the one that acted as an Anbu captain. I guess you're still in the mood for jokes since you're not in any danger. Ken smiled widely under his cracked mask, somewhat amused at the little care Saburo was showing for the village he technically represented. Indeed, this village is spent. You've already killed around half of our forces in a few minutes. We obviously give up at this point. I'm not even sure this formation can hold you here honestly. Saburo raised his hands with a wry smile as he spoke about the hidden village, essentially surrendering to a bounty hunter. The strawman really couldn't care less. At the very least, he didn't lose that many of his clones. The only troubling part was they would likely have to find a new hideout. None of the 5 hidden villages was likely to accept him either, so things were bound to get a bit more difficult for him. So you guys want me to leave? Huh? Ken tilted his head as he spoke, smiling a bit under his mask. Essentially, yes. The elders have reached the conclusion that they can't go on any longer. You've won is what we're saying. The village surrenders. Saburo waved his hand around a bit as he explained a few things to Ken. Yu on the side looked at Ken with absolute hate. He wanted to keep going, but since Ken was not showing any signs of slowing down or being tired, and there was no injury on him, continuing to fight simply felt irresponsible to him. We've already lost too much today. We need to get back on our feet, recuperate our strength, and get much stronger than before if we want to even approach this monster again. We'll have to survive against the other hidden villages first. Alright then. If you want me to leave, you'll have to give me a few things. Ken immediately started negotiating, realizing that the village was basically begging him to leave them alone. Might as well take them for all they've got, right? POV narration. The very concept of an entire hidden village surrendering to a bounty hunter was unheard of. And that was with good reason. Even the grass village, one of the weakest ones, had around 350 shinobi. Around 40 of them were just Saburo's clones. Even if the majority of them were genin, they made up a force large enough to make other villages wary of them. The grass village was by no means strong, but they were stable enough, especially since it once had the support of the Leaf Village. Village politics was still a difficult thing, and a hidden village would never stick its head out for another unless the situation was dire. So Elder Yu was well aware that the red dot would get away scot-free even after killing so many of their shinobi. There were only around 270 shinobi in the village when Ken attacked. The rest were either away on mission or dead. Now, only around 156 of them were alive and in fighting condition, and Ken didn't even seem fazed by the fight that had been happening up to that point. That was why the elders, with Yu at the helm, decided that it would be better to call the entire fight off. If I had known he was this powerful, I wouldn't have gone after him in the first place. Yu was quite annoyed by the situation, but the fact was already consummated. Their losses already materialized. They sent Saburo to speak to him. As the ambi captain, he was the most powerful in their village. They hoped the formation would be able to hold Ken there, but even if he was held there, they wouldn't be able to do much to him. The formation would fall apart when the shinobi forming it ran out of chakra anyway, so they couldn't hold him there forever. How much is your village willing to give exactly? Yu could hear Ken's voice from inside the formation as the masked monster crossed his arms and tilted his head at Saburo. Well, at this point, I am sure you'd be able to talk the elders into giving you anything. Saburo's response was a bit grating for Yu to hear, but they'd surely get to speak about that later. Money. This village is willing to pay you a good sum if you agree to leave without taking any more lives. As a bounty hunter, you surely appreciate wealth. Yu interjected from the side, knowing that Saburo wasn't going to say anything to benefit their village. I am not interested in your wealth, more like, I've already stolen most of it. I want techniques, jutsu, as many as you can give me, including this formation. The red dot spoke out with a grin. A bounty hunter doesn't want money. Yu was completely flabbergasted by that fact alone. Ken requesting techniques off of them was even more insulting. Our jutsu and techniques are our bread and butter. We can't afford to give all of our secrets to a bounty hunter. We've not even managed to recover our secret techniques from that stupid thief. Yu was feeling livid at that point, but he couldn't snap at Ken either, as they truly didn't have any leverage over the bounty hunter. As much as Yu hated it, Saburo was completely right when saying the elders would give him anything to just leave them alone. Jutsu, huh? Sounds manageable. But you obviously won't get all of the ones in this village. Saburo smiled calmly, clearly not bothered by the situation at all. Let's make this simple. I want at least 2S rank, at least 20A rank, and of the rest, I want at least 30 to 40 each. Ken's words immediately served to give you a brain aneurysm. That's outrageous. A bounty hunter asking for this many techniques. Plenty of voices around seemed shocked and livid at Ken's request. Many were also confused, but in truth, no one really dared to refuse Ken's requests at that point. Saburo simply narrowed his eyes. So you're building an organization? Huh? His voice was lower than before, only Kansas managing to catch it. You'll find out soon. How does my request sound though? Ken's long hair danced in the wind along with his burnt and tattered cloak. Well, the village can provide you with copies for a few techniques. There aren't that many S-rank techniques in this village, so you won't be able to pick and choose. But I'm guessing you aren't requesting specific techniques. Saburo stroked his chin, trying to think more about Ken's words. I'll find out soon. Huh, this does sound promising. Saburo was already looking to cut ties with the already collapsing grass village. Getting a ticket to join an organization headed by a person on the level or close to the level of the 5 cages sounded great to the strawman. It was certainly going to be easier than trying to convince another small hidden village to accept him in their ranks. Indeed, as long as they have practicality. I don't care what type of technique I get. The blind swordsman nodded as his body started transforming back into that of a human. Saburo raised an eyebrow when noticing that change, and smirked as he noticed that Ken was indeed not injured in any way. At least we managed to de-escalate the situation. Saburo was also quite glad that he didn't have to lose any more of his clones. The elders could also finally heave a sigh of relief when seeing him change back into a more human form. For 1 second, the thought of trying to kill Ken while his guard was down appeared in Yu's mind. But he wasn't willing to risk it and anger him again. Their losses were already substantial. Is that all, Red Dot? Saburo said as he smiled at the bounty hunter. For now, I will state any further requests after seeing this one fulfilled. Ken crossed his arms as he looked at the barrier surrounding him. Might as well take this down, since we're now on negotiating terms. Also, bring me my blade. I left it somewhere near the rubble. The blind swordsman tapped his leg on the ground a few times as he wondered how far he could push the village with his requests. It was clear that if he asked for too much, they'd just try to kill him again. At that point, the shinobi were trying to get rid of him and cut their losses, while they could still recover from them. They thankfully didn't know that he had already visited all of the clan bases and stolen all the money that he could find, otherwise they would have fought to the death. Ken watched as the shinobi scrambled on the orders of the elders, some going to the library, while others looked for his blade. They were still unwilling to get close to him, but they did stop the formation. In the end, one shinboy came and brought Ken his blade. Yet another one of Saburo's clones. It only took around 10 minutes for the others to come back with a few dozen scrolls and manuals. It was clear that they were trying to just make Ken leave as quickly as possible. Saburo watched on as the grass village struggled to grant Ken's request. He could only sigh in disappointment at the pathetic state of the village he had been working with. He figured the village would try something, like placing a chakra tracking seal on some of the scrolls, but at the end of the day, it wouldn't help them in any way. Even if they tracked the red dot, he'd still just kill whoever they send after him. All in all, Saburo considered the situation quite shocking to witness, but he didn't show any of his emotions outwardly. After Ken placed all of the scrolls and manuals in a sealing scroll of his own and stored everything in the seal on his wrist, he looked back at Saburo, who just smiled. So he won't even look over them. Huh, I guess he doesn't care what techniques he gets from us. A bit irresponsible. But he may have his reasons, so, is there anything else you need? Or are you prepared to leave? Saburo said with that same smile on his face. Ken could almost hear the teeth of Elder Yu filing against each other. The elder was looking pointedly at Saburo, almost wanting to stab him with his gaze. Why the hell would you ask if he needs anything else? Just tell him to leave. Alas, it was already too late for him to interject, as Ken started speaking while he was still busy ripping out what little hair he had left. One last request, I want you to either join me or give me your technique. Ken smiled widely as he spoke, making Saburo narrow his eyes once more. The strawman couldn't help but raise an eyebrow at how forward the bounty hunter was, though he didn't really mind. A leader should have at least this much confidence. Unfortunately, my technique requires a specific bloodline limit to work. Only members of my already extinct clan would be able to use it. The strawman shrugged a bit, not bothering to lie to the bounty hunter. His technique was something specific to him, and he was neither willing nor able to share it. This is not acceptable. Asking for our ambu captain to join you is overstepping your boundaries. Yu from the side immediately protested, not willing to part with the only failsafe their village had left in case they got attacked. Saburo was far too valuable for them to just part ways with easily. Unfortunately for them, Saburo was far from loyal to their village. I am willing to follow you, as long as you are able to provide me with the proper resources to continue my studies and rituals. Saburo surprisingly agreed with Ken's requests without much hesitation. Of course, you will have plenty of resources, of that I assure you, even more so than in this village. Ken simply nodded, quite pleased with the answer. The elders and nearby shinobi were flabbergasted to hear that. Their morale was already low. Now it was just reaching rock bottom. Saburo, what is the meaning of this? Yu asked loudly as his throat turned red, his voice bubbling with rage and frustration. A man must know when to cut his losses, Elder Yu. No reason for someone that isn't the captain or related to him to hang around a sinking ship. Saburo didn't seem to care about the morale of the village's shinobi at all anymore. Ken couldn't help but chuckle a bit when hearing how cruel he was. But that cruelty helped the blind swordsman assess the strawman's character a bit better. This will be a purely business relationship. This man has no loyalty to give, alas. I don't need loyalty from him. I just need his services and expertise. The grass village refuses this offer. The elder stared hatefully at Ken and Saburo now, his eyes turning bloodshot from rage as his pulse pounded audibly, at least for Ken. Well then, I guess I'll just cut ties with the grass village directly. Saburo simply shrugged, nonchalantly betraying the village and annoying the elder further. Ambu Captain, please reconsider. After everything the village has done for you, plenty of shinobi started doing their best to urge the strawman to remain. Former friends and acquaintances pleaded with him to remain, to not leave their village in such dire straits. But Saburo knew of no friendship. To him the grass village was just a means to an end. And now that mean was looking like it wouldn't be able to help him achieve his end anymore. Elder Yu was well aware of that. He wasn't stupid enough to think that someone like Saburo treated the friendship and camaraderie they instilled into their child soldiers seriously. You aren't allowed to leave. All troops capture Saburo and his ambuscu. Yu was quick to try and give an order, but he was immediately surrounded by 4 different masked shinobi, all of them holding blades to his throat and arms, close enough to cut the skin. The close proximity prevented him from performing any jutsu, and it also made the other shinobi present unable to interfere, as they were milliseconds away from killing one of the few elders left in their village. One wrong move and you die here. One of the shinobi spoke in a cold tone, pressing his blade close to the elder's neck without any hesitation. Yu simply gulped a bit as he cursed the carelessness of his troops. Alas, they had no way of knowing that Saburo's squad was just filled with clones. Only a small percentage of shinobi were privy to that knowledge, and most of them were either dead or injured at that point. Yes, all 4 of the shinobi were Saburo's clones. The rest of the clones rushed into the center of the shinobi encirclement and formed another smaller circle, shielding Saburo and Ken. To the others, it looked like Saburo's Ambu squad was also defecting with him. There seemed to be around 24 of them left, but Ken did notice Saburo sending a few of them away during the fight, so their number was likely a bit bigger than that. Confusion and outrage spread throughout the grass shinobi, and Yu was sweating heavily. The veins on his forehead had already popped, as the clones seemed to be intent on stopping him from acting. I will be taking my squad and leaving. I don't want to kill any of my former comrades, so don't follow me. Saburo narrowed his eyes as he looked at the surrounding shinobi. The strawman tugged at the heartstrings of the grass shinobi. Ken was a bit impressed by the level of bullshit that Saburo was spewing. Comrades. Bah. Didn't know this guy was also a comedian. Although Ken found it funny, that was just because he had already figured Saburo to be a shrewd and opportunistic sociopath. The other shinobi were still coming to terms with his departure, so they were seemingly hesitant. Saburo didn't look at any of them as he walked past. The grass shinobi seemed to just stand there and look at each other with despair in their eyes. In the end, they could only make way for Ken and Saburo's clones to leave the village. You are quite decent at manipulating others, Ken said in a low tone as he continued to walk, just making conversation with his new member. I'll take that as a compliment. Saburo simply nodded, a calm smile on his face as all of his clones followed suit. It was a compliment, Ken said as he and the clones stepped out of the front gate of the village. The 4 clones that were holding the elder hostage also tried to flee after Ken, and the rest of the clones managed to depart from the village. But the elder wasn't about to just let them leave. The enraged elder Yu immediately trapped them all in overgrown grass and thorny vines, his teeth cracking in anger as he started barking orders again. Kill them, the elder shouted, taking out his rage on the clones that had almost taken his life. The shinobi around him seemed to look at each other for a few seconds, before listening to his orders and burning all of the clones alive using a few fireballs. The clones stood eerily still, not even bothering to protect themselves as they started burning alive. Such a scene managed to further unnerve the people present. The rest of Saburo's clones didn't even bother to turn around and look at them, as they had already left the village gates. Yu, in the end, was just left with 4 burnt corpses that had once been Saburo's clones, an extremely demoralized ragtag group of shinobi, and a few buildings to rebuild. The angry elder took a few deep breaths to calm down. He wasn't stupid enough to pursue Saburo outside of the village. Ken was also with him, so it was impossible for their village to attack the strawman. For now, announce to the world that Saburo is a missing nin. He is to be branded a criminal. Yu spoke in a much calmer voice. He was still confident that the village wouldn't fall, even if they were bound to have to suck up to a higher power, as Sir the enemy must have brainwashed Sir Saburo. There's no way he'd do something like an injured Jonin to the side try to plead for Saburo. It seemed that the poor shinobi was likely fooled by the strawman's act. There were plenty of people like him. Saburo had spent a good decade in that village, so plenty of people were able to get accustomed to him and befriend him. Yu was hearing none of it though. Don't kid yourself. Saburo is just a criminal now. I don't want to hear anything else. The elder didn't care to explain that they had all been fooled by a sociopath. He only gave them the orders and continued on with his work. At least we still had the funds to rebuild. We need to do a quick inventory of everything and recover everything from the collapsed cage building. Yu was quick to get to work. Unfortunately for him, their funds had just happened to disappear. Well, not all of them. A part of their finances was kept in the cage building, but the bulk of it was spread out throughout all of the clans in the village. Yu ordered everyone to do a quick check on their resources. He now controlled them, since all of the clan heads were now dead, and he was to manage their finances until new leaders were appointed. He received the report that everything was gone rather quickly. Even the funds from his compound were gone, and he had amassed significant wealth there. The last hair on Yu's head fell out when he heard that report. He was left completely shell-shocked by it. But it didn't take long for him to realize where those funds may have disappeared to curse that bounty hunter. Not interested in our wealth, my ass, Yu looked at the wrecked state of their village with empty eyes, his mind wondering how exactly to avoid total destruction. But one thought surfaced in his mind. I won't forget this, Red Dot Saburo. Both of you will pay for this. POV narration. Ken and Saburo's clones continued dashing from tree to tree, with the blind swordsman adjusting his speed and allowing the clones to keep up with him. They eventually stopped in the middle of a clearing, with Saburo looking at Ken with a curious gaze through many pairs of eyes. So, now that we are away from that mess, what does your organization have to offer, Red Dot? One of Saburo's clones stepped forward, who had been acting as an Anbu captain previously. First off, call me Ken. That moniker is not something I actually go by. Ken sighed as he sat down a bit, speaking in an even tone with Saburo. Second of all, my organization is still quite new and growing. It hasn't even made an appearance in the world as of now. Ken didn't bother lying or sugarcoating the state of his organization. So we're talking about a fledgling group of nameless shinobi. Saburo's tone sounded a bit less impressed. We aren't exclusively recruiting former shinobi. Plenty of our recruits are just former orphans that we deem talented enough to learn. Ken wasn't exactly discouraged. He had already decided that Saburo was going to join him, so he wasn't exactly stressed out about impressing the strawman with the state of his organization. He can either prove to be a great asset or a liability. If he refuses to join, or his demands are too annoying, then I will kill him and all of his clones. If he joins, then all the better. His technique does seem extremely useful for reconnaissance. Former orphans. Well, I guess that's certainly a way to build up a loyal following. Say, how many people are there currently in this organization? Adjusting to development speed and some information that my right hand provided, there should currently be around 16 people, 15 of which are in training. Ken remembered Tosho mentioning that he had found a dilapidated orphanage to recruit from. So the blind swordsman expected even more people to be recruited on his next time checking up with Tosho. That doesn't sound quite as promising as what I had in mind. Saburo seemed wholly disappointed now. The only reason I'm still even talking to this man is that he is truly powerful enough to build something great in the future. He will certainly build something worth joining, but I also need support in the short term. The strawman scratched his chin a few times, weighing his options. I can see you aren't quite as satisfied with what you're hearing. Ken decided to just call out the strawman on his indecisiveness. I won't lie to you, Ken. I expected a lot more from someone like you. But you did say it's a new organization. I can understand a bit of hesitation. Maybe I can help convince you further. Currently, I am close to 11 years old. My current strength should speak for itself. Ken decided to attract Saburo with his talent instead, seeing as his organization wasn't proving to be enough. Saburo and all of his clones seemed to start choking instantly when hearing that. Any composure that the strawman might have had vanished completely. He studied Ken for a few seconds, and now he could see it. Ken was still short by adult standards. He was also skinny by adult standards, even if he was well-defined. In retrospect, one could still guess Ken's age from his appearance, but his raspy voice, scars, and overall demeanor made it absolutely impossible for anyone to guess his age. To think that the one to bring a village to its knees would be a child. Saburo still remembered seeing Ken coldly ripping people apart, how his tail and claws cut through everyone who even got close to him. If he is already this strong, then he even has a chance to become the next god of shinobi, doesn't he? I would ask for further proof, but I doubt someone like you would have any identity documents relating to any nation. Saburo smiled with a glint in his eyes. Ken just nodded, not bothering to say anything more after confirming his age. Since he's so young, doesn't that mean I can take advantage of his lack of experience and end up leading this organization? No, I can think about that later. He doesn't seem especially inexperienced in the ways of the world either. I agree then, just because I want to see how much you are able to grow in the future. If your organization grows large enough to rival other villages, then that's also good. Saburo extended his hand, and Ken shook it without any hesitation. The masked swordsman's grip was strong, much stronger than a child's grip had any right to be. Saburo could only sweat a bit at that. I'm guessing we'd want to go to your main body first, right? It's not even that far from here. Ken then turned his head in a random direction, and Saburo instantly paled, retracting his hand and jumping away in fear. Saburo's voice was filled with fear. For a few seconds, he had forgotten how dangerous Ken was, letting his guard down and thinking of him as a child. Your clones, you are connected to every single one. I discovered this during the fight. but a thread of chakra exists between you and all of the clones. Ken didn't bother to tell the scared strawman that he needed to be in contact with the clones in order to feel that connection they had with the main body. He felt that there was no need to get into details. No reason to act scared now. You are already part of my organization. I don't see any need to harm you right now. Ken then started walking in that random direction, with Saburo slowly walking behind him alongside his many clones. Right now? Huh, so I guess taking advantage of him isn't going to be easy. The strawman almost wanted to scowl, but he didn't wish to show any displeasure to the blind monster in front of him. Saburo simply decided to see where their partnership would go. It wasn't like he was planning on backstabbing Ken anytime soon, or ever, depending on how things went. By the way, I'm assuming I shouldn't expect too many funds right now, correct? Moving will necessitate quite a bit of equipment being left behind, as it isn't easy to carry, too big to fit in a ceiling scroll too. The strawman said as he followed a few steps behind the blind monster. Funding won't be an issue. I have made quite a bit during my bounty hunting career. Also, I stole all of the money I could find in the grass village, so we aren't exactly strapped for cash. Ken smiled a bit as he continued walking. Saburo only smiled when hearing that, chuckling a bit internally, as he remembered Ken bragging about not being interested in their wealth. The way that the child in front of him could shamelessly lie right in front of the face of every shinobi present was actually astoundingly amusing to the strawman. I guess following his orders will be more entertaining than following a few crusty old men, and since it's a small organization with a lot of cash, I can receive much larger funding! Saburo almost couldn't help but smile at the thought of continuing his experiments unhindered. Ken and the clones continued strolling all the way to a large tree. Ken yawned a bit before tapping the trunk of the tree with the tip of his shoe in a specific spot. After noticing that nothing was happening, he raised his leg a bit more and was about to kick the tree away. Saburo stopped him though, sweating a bit as he did so. No need to destroy the entrance. This place could still be useful. The strawman's argument was actually extremely reasonable, so Ken ended up just nodding and allowing Saburo to open up the fake tree. The clone stepped forward and tapped the tree in a few specific locations a few times until a lock mechanism seemed to click and a part of the trunk slid open like a tatami door. Nice hiding spot, Ken said as he felt the opening lead down through the roots of the fake tree and into a large underground cave. It did take a few years on the run to come up with something like this. Saburo shrugged, quite pleased with the compliment, although he was still disappointed an almost 11-year-old child would be able to find his main body and hideout. Saburo's clones made way for Ken, who jumped down the open fake tree and landed in a rather well-lit corridor that led to a metallic door. The clones followed suit and once again opened the door for him using a strange set of hand signs. There was some type of seal spread out on the door from what Ken could sense. This place really is rather well defended. I wonder how much it would take to build something similar for our organization. By the way, what name does this organization of ours have? Saburo asked as the steel door slid open. The name is still a work in progress, Ken simply shrugged, sensing the inside of the laboratory with a calm smile. This place is a lot bigger than I expected. The laboratory was much bigger inside than even the cage building he had besieged previously, so Ken was a tad surprised by the amount of work put into that secret hideout. The organization has no name. Saburo sweated a bit when he heard that, looking around and wondering just how new the organization actually was. Well, we are still only a few months off from starting it. No reason to rush. We won't be announcing it to the world anytime soon either. Ken simply shrugged away the strawman's concern. Well, the name would also help provide the current members with a sense of belonging. If we play things right, the name isn't just for outsiders. Saburo scratched the back of his head as he brought a rather good point to the table, something that Ken hadn't really thought about. I guess you're right. Ken started scratching his chin instantly, somewhat embarrassed, but not quite enough to react outwardly in any way. We'll have to come up with a name by the time we return. I guess we will. Saburo was a bit confused when hearing that, his eyebrows scrunched up together as he looked at Ken through many pairs of eyes. You're officially one of the leaders of this organization and the one in charge of all research. I hereby give you the right to help me come up with a name. Ken crossed his arms and spoke in a resolute, confident tone. An outsider wouldn't even notice just how shamelessly the blind swordsman was pushing his work onto Saburo if they listened to his tone. His confidence made it look as if he was rewarding Saburo in some way. I guess he really is still a child. Well, I can still work with this. Saburo was too flabbergasted to speak for a while, and Ken continued inside. I guess I'll come up with a few possible names by the time we arrive at the location of our main base. The strawman could only relent, not willing to call out his new leader on his shamelessness. Is this place to your liking, Ken? Another version of Saburo walked up to the group from inside the room. Behind him were another 24 clones. Oh, finally speaking to the original. Huh, this place is much nicer than I expected, Ken said as he turned his head towards the one that had stepped forward. From what the blind swordsman could feel, the original Saburo looked much the same as his clones did. He was however dressed in casual attire, and not wearing a headband of any kind. The original Saburo also seemed to be about as much chakra as a high-level jonin. Though Ken had no way of knowing how good he really was when it came to technique, he could just assume that he was at least as good as his clones were. I am indeed the original, though I didn't think anyone would be able to catch on to my technique so easily. Saburo tilted his head and smiled warmly at his new leader. The strawman instantly decided to start sucking up to Ken, but it didn't seem to be having much of an effect. As well faked as his smile was, Ken still didn't react to it in any visible way. I am just special. I doubt anyone would be able to tell you apart from your clones under normal circumstances. Ken was quite sure that he was speaking the truth. He was also quite sure that the elders of the Grass Village actually thought that one of the Anbu clones was actually Saburo. From the number of people that had come to greet him at the door, Ken could also observe that Saburo had kept quite a few clones hidden from the village. Special, huh? I guess he truly is special in more ways than one. His talent is quite unheard of under normal circumstances. My technique would be flawless. Yet you also managed to find this place with relative ease. That's inevitable. My powers as a censor are a lot greater than any shinobi I've ever met. I would say that is actually my strongest point. Ken nodded his head, looking to reassure the strawman that his technique wasn't exactly faulty in any way. Understood that is his strongest point. So that transformation, coupled with his skill in Taijutsu and Kenjutsu, are not even his main powers. Now, let us start heading out. Have you already grabbed everything you needed from this place? The blind swordsman asked as he tapped the tip of his shoe on the ground a few times. He could feel quite a lot of interesting things residing inside that laboratory, including amount of corpses that Ken assumed were shinobi. The blind swordsman was still quite unwilling to harm innocent even if they were civilians. I won't be getting into a fight with Saburo over this. He's too useful and they are already dead, so it can't be helped. I'll just make sure his victims are criminals and other shinobi in the future. I have already prepared everything that is needed. I don't wish to destroy this place, however. I hope that is okay with you. Saburo seemed happy to leave as soon as possible, but he still wanted to keep the laboratory intact. No reason to destroy it. Seems like it could be useful in the future as well. Ken seemed to be quite okay with it. He had already not destroyed the entrance, so it wasn't like he was going to have a change of heart. Let's get going. We still need to go and get Akira, the thief. Yet, he is also a recruit. And just like that, Ken and Saburo started heading off. Saburo's clones now were somewhere around 50 in total, so the organization's numbers were bolstered greatly just like that. The blind swordsman continued dashing from tree to tree, quite excited to make his way back home and introduce Tosho to the new recruits. EOV narration. Ken and Saburo started making their way toward the cave that Akira resided in without wasting more time. They had sealed the secret lair entrance to keep it hidden and intact, to make sure no one would just accidentally stumble upon it. Though that was already unlikely, Ken realized that if a censor as good as him ran by it, they could still spot it. But it was really impossible to plan for all possible situations. Still, the blind swordsman was quite pleased with the way things had developed. With Saburo, we've gained 45 able-bodied shinobi, all chunin or above. Well, 44 to be more exact. I doubt the original body will ever go in any missions. He shouldn't even be allowed to. Losing him would be a lot more annoying than losing a single highly trained assassin. With his help, I can finally jumpstart this organization for good, start hunting bounties on a broader scale. Ken was well and truly excited for Saburo to settle into his little organization. Getting the strawman's allegiance was the greatest reward for all of his trouble with the Grass Village. Their techniques and money were also good, but he wasn't even sure how much money was in the scrolls he had stolen, nor what techniques he had received. The most valuable thing is the friends we made along the way. Ken couldn't help but laugh internally at his own bad jokes, some small chuckles escaping outside, as the blind swordsman was not as cautious as usual. The most amusing part was that Ken and Saburo were the furthest apart from friends. They were both well aware that as soon as their business relationship soured, they would be at each other's throats with no hesitation. Ken put no trust in Saburo, and the strawman was not oblivious to that. No, he even respected it. Such is the mentality one must have in this bleak world. That was what the strawman thought, though he found it exceedingly odd that a child could adapt to their world so quickly and easily. Ken's occasional giggle and raspy chuckle along the way as he remembered some random joke was the only thing that could remind Saburo that the blind monster was still a child. The strawman always just looked at the masked child with a raised eyebrow, not bothering to ask what had amused him so much. The entire situation was amusing to him to begin with, so he wasn't about to judge the perpetrator for laughing. An entire village begging the one they had attacked to please leave them alone was a funny prospect. Ken and Saburo reached Akira's cave after a few more minutes. Instantly, Akira became alert when seeing close to 50 shinobi descend on his hideout. He immediately tried to run away, but seeing Ken calmed him down greatly. The thought of Ken allying himself with the Grass Village and hunting him down again didn't even cross his mind. Well, it had slightly. Ken was traveling with plenty of shinobi visibly wearing a grass village headband, but Akira shoved the idea out quickly, as it was a rather stupid conclusion to reach. After all, if that had been the case, Ken would have already knocked him out and/or killed him. He also took notice of Ken's appearance. His long coat was now both tattered and bloody. It also revealed parts of his body, filled with scars and lithe muscles, but no wounds whatsoever. "I was about to think you wouldn't make it back, boss." Akira immediately started calling Ken his boss, and rubbing his hands together like a shrewd businessman. Seeing him come back unscathed made Akira want to follow him immediately. After all, someone that could stand up to an entire village was usually someone worth following, and Akira was already a wanted man. He needed protection. "If you keep doing that with your hands, I'll cut them off." Akira immediately stopped rubbing his hands together at Ken's threat though. "What's with all of the shinobi though? Are you getting escorted out of their territory or something?" Akira pointed at Saburo and his many clones. "They will be joining me from now on. I am building an organization currently, and some extra hands are welcome. Yours will do just fine too." Ken decided to just be upfront with Akira, as he wanted to invite the thief to join them as well. "Thanks, boss. I'd be more than glad to join you." Akira immediately kneeled in front of the bounty hunter, calling him boss once more. His shamelessness made Saburo sweat slightly, but the strawman could understand the thief's thought process well enough. The weak follow the strong for benefit. That much is just natural law at this point. Is it really wise to trust the former shinobi of the village you just raided? Akira was a bit skeptical about Saburo though. "I assure you that our relationship with the grass village was nothing more than transactional." Saburo decided to step out and speak for himself. Meanwhile, his clones also just threw away their headbands, as they didn't need them anyway. Akira could only raise an eyebrow at that. Shinobi never threw away their headbands. They never threw away the marks of their original village, even if they cut a line in the middle of it. It was a sign of loyalty, a sign that something still tied them to the place they came from. Be it spite, hatred, longing, or regret, all rogue shinobi kept their headbands. In truth, most of them were just brainwashed to think highly of their respective hidden villages from a young age. All of their friends and families gathered in one place. It was a great way to foster loyal shinobi, and it was also extremely easy to indoctrinate them and convince them that dying for the village was acceptable and even heroic. The hidden villagers had managed to draw a parallel in between families and the village. Some had even managed to convince shinobi to put the village above their families. The good of the village was, at the end of the day, much more important than personal happiness and the safety of your loved ones. Other times, the safety of the village was directly related to the happiness of your loved ones. It was a rather well thought out system. Few outsiders could see it for what it was, and Akira was one of them, as he had seen many shinobi, and he had traveled a lot despite his young age. That was why the scene of shinobi just throwing away their headbands was so jarring. But it did its job of convincing Akira. The thief was still a bit skeptical, of course, but he didn't voice any displeasure anymore. Ken didn't bother to explain that Saburo was just one person, extremely sadistic and opportunistic at that. The blind swordsman also didn't bother to introduce Akira to anyone but the original strawman, calling him the de facto leader of the deserting shinobi. Akira was a bit weirded out by how silent every single one of the shinobi was, but he didn't voice out any more complaints. He was just glad that his savior/benefactor was back in one piece. The thief was rather shocked to hear a bit more about what had transpired in the village, but it was still within his expectations after seeing Ken decimate the group that had attacked them. It was already clear enough that numbers won't help you much against the red dot. This just helps solidify that, and this should also help the world realize that he isn't someone to mess around with. Still, none of the people present expected the news to come out of the village quickly. They expected the grass village to internally suppress it for a few weeks at the very least. They didn't know that a storm was already brewing throughout the world. In but a few hours, every important figure got wind of the fact that a single bounty hunter brought a hidden village to its knees. Buhahaha. Hey, the third Raikage couldn't help but burst out laughing when reading that. He slapped his desk with jubilation as he heartily laughed at how absurd Ken's achievements seemed to be for a single bounty hunter. Immediately, the Raikage became even more interested to have the masked assassin in his fold. Not only was the report thorough, it included everything, even the fact that the grass village was forced to surrender, and that they weren't able to do any meaningful damage to the red dot. Overall, the reputation of the grass village was tarnished, and their power was extremely diminished, with even their Anbu captain and a sizable number of Anbu going and joining the bounty hunter instead. It was a pathetic loss for a hidden village to ever admit to. Even the Raikage was shocked to see how willing the grass village was to write on its own sorry condition. However, the Raikage couldn't really bring himself to laugh at them, as he could see exactly what the elders of the hidden village were trying to do. They seemed to have a rather clear goal in mind when announcing their failure so quickly, asking for aid from one of its former allies, Konohagaka, the village hidden in the leaves. Elder Yu was initially going to try to bide his time a bit, but discovering that he had absolutely nothing to work with inside the village, He knew that the faster he revealed everything and asked for help, the better he was off. The hidden village immediately called Saburo and his shinobi criminals. They didn't denounce him for any of his unsavory experiments though, as they didn't wish to implicate themselves with that. Thankfully, the second shinobi war was already coming to an end, and most of the villagers were somewhat spent. None were willing to attack the grass village when reading reports that Ken had already taken everything from them, and they also didn't have much land or resources to take either, as it was a rather small nation. By revealing the news in such a way, the shrewd elder had managed to momentarily take the target off his back and put it on the bounty hunter. That was now technically one of the richest men alive. Such power and wealth are currently just roaming the world. Many bounty hunters were tempted to try their hand at the newly risen Red Dot, but not that many were actually willing to try. His reputation was already quite fickle before, but now it had already reached a whole new level. It was clear that no shinobi was going to stop by and sit down at any of his roadside grill parties. The fear had now truly set in, and it was clear that Ken didn't just go for targets. It was still unknown what exactly made Ken attack the village, so people would rather choose to not find out on their own skin. The limits of the Red Dot's patience, that is. The 5Kage were well aware of the full situation though, especially those that had wanted Ken dead. No one bothered to speak out on Ken's reasons, so there remained a mystery, and the blind swordsman was called a bloodthirsty monster and criminal. Ken and the rest had caught wind of that about 1 week into their journey while passing through a small village. The people there were visibly fearful of Ken and his men. A squad of close to 50 shinobi rolling up on a village was rather intimidating after all. They also received other new and rather interesting pieces of information. The second shinobi war has officially ended. 1 week. In 1 week the villagers had finally stopped their fights. The highlights. Konohagaka had managed to defeat Amekiga and Sunagaka, or at least it did so on paper. Losses were great on all sides. Now, the Leaf Village was the strongest hidden village. It had proven itself by fighting on multiple fronts, and having the most powerful shinobi. For one, the Hokage, Sarutobi Hiruzen, the current god of shinobi, is said to have mastered all ninjutsu. There were also his disciples, all 3 of which had become renowned in the war, and had gained the title of the SANNIN' legendary 3 shinobi. They had gained their titles by facing off against Hanzo of the Rain, who had bestowed the titles upon them by himself during their battle. It was a rather heroic tale, as Hanzo was known for his strength and man powerful enough to stand on the same stage as the 5Kage. Another prominent figure was Konoha's White Fang, who had also distinguished himself against the Sunagaka. Overall, the village was simply brimming with talent and power. How could it not? Especially with the strong foundation that the first and second Hokage had left them. Still, the end of the war made no difference to Ken. It only meant that he would be able to go about his business while witnessing a bit less bloodshed on the way. The blind swordsman was already lucky enough to have stumbled upon 3 different sites, where shinobi had killed each other en masse during his bounty hunting. It was a rather grim scene, and even nature seemed unwilling to grow there for a while, though that might have been because of the scorched ground and cracked earth. Ken and the rest continued their journey without bothering too much to dwell on the news. It wasn't like they didn't expect the grass village to paint Ken as some sort of maniac. That much was so obvious that it hadn't even deserved mention before. The point that the blind swordsman had wanted to make had still come across. That he was a bounty hunter whom one shouldn't be messing around with. That was the reputation that Ken had wanted to build when he had set out in the first place, so in a sense, he could thank the grass village for the help. Ken also remembered something quite crucial as soon as he entered the forest where his hideout was. I forgot to tell Tosho to prepare housing for all of us ahead of time. POV narration when naming an organization. It was important to get across the message of what the organization was about and for. In truth, Ken had no clue what to name it initially. He wanted the organization to be his eyes in that world, but he didn't want to give them a name hinting at his lack of vision. While he didn't care about that fact getting out, he didn't want to put an even bigger sign on his back claiming that he was special. After all, when Ken finally took his mask off and Akira and Saburo saw his face, both of them seemed petrified. Saburo especially, who had personally seen Ken in action. His blindness didn't affect his awareness of the world in any great manner, but knowing he used his senses to see allowed others to find ways to use that as a weakness against him. Just like the explosions had overloaded his senses for a few seconds back in the grass village. If Ken was fighting a powerful shinobi that was already privy to the fact that the blind monster was susceptible to such attacks, they would have used them to distract him constantly. There was a clear fix for that. King could always just use his nature energy to sense his surroundings constantly. There was nothing stopping him from sensing others using that, as no living life form could truly hide their natural energy. The problem was that Ken would have to shut off his other senses, making him well and truly blind to the world. He would feel the aura, he would feel attacks coming, but he would not be able to see them. It would be like a normal SENSOR well. the sage, fighting with a blindfold on. In the end, Ken decided to keep that part of him a secret in order to avoid enemies taking advantage of it when the time came. So that left him without any ideas of how to name the group he was creating. That was when Saburo came with a few pieces of advice and ideas. Why not come up with something to strengthen the bond between recruits? Make them feel like they belong in something more than just a bounty collecting business and information gathering squad. The former shinobi came up with plenty of ideas that Ken liked when it came to strengthening the bond. All of them are greater than the last. He also wanted the name to represent their work. He wanted a name that people would hear once and would understand what type of business they dealt in. But eventually, the name that Ken settled on was something that Akira came up with. How about the Duck Brotherhood? It's a brotherhood, so it will help with forging the bonds between recruits later. And we do plan to be assassins mainly, so something broody like that sounds fitting. It was a bit simplistic, maybe, but it somehow managed to both give their organization some identity and help with forging bonds between the recruits, which was exactly what they were brainstorming towards anyway. Having all recruits be brothers and seniors/teachers to be elder brothers and elders, in general, was a bit of a classic when it came to creating camaraderie and strengthening bonds. Still, there was really no reason to reinvent the wheel at the end of the day. Saburo also instantly liked the idea, and Ken had nothing to complain about it either. The blind swordsman was more than glad to be able to tell Tosho about their organization, now finally had a name. There was still the problem of housing though. Tosho came out with a blade as soon as he felt around 50 shinobi descending on his location. He instantly calmed down when seeing Ken's masked face in front of them all. His situational awareness wasn't so bad that he would attack a group led by his leader. He immediately rushed to greet them, or more specifically Ken. "Leader," Tosho shouted as he arrived in front of them with impressive speed, shocking Akira slightly. The masked retainer immediately took a knee and bowed his head, much like one would when greeting a king. Saburo and Akira also looked at the compound and the man kneeling before them with a curious gaze. A tall black-haired man dressed much like Ken, a red armor covered by a black coat and a straw hat. The only difference was that his mask had one red line in the middle of it instead of a dot. Saburo instantly narrowed his eyes when seeing him. His speed, his lack of presence, all of them made the strawman quite wary. This man Ken's second in command. He feels a bit worse than regular Jonin when it comes to chakra, but he seems to be almost as difficult to detect as Ken himself, so he is certainly a master assassin. Saburo immediately judged Tosho as a dangerous individual. Even if his chakra reserves weren't anything special, Tosho was still the most skilled person in the Dark Brotherhood, with the exception of Saburo himself and Ken of course. Akira wasn't able to judge Tosho's skills that much, just muttering that he felt a bit sneaky, before finally looking around at their base. It was strangely big and rather homey. About a dozen somewhat large wooden homes and one large training area with targets, rocks and wooden dummies. All buildings were designed beautifully and spaced out perfectly, the area having clearly been made with great passion. The entire small village was built right in front of a large cave entrance, which seemed to have a sealable entrance using a wooden gate and an actual airtight seal that Tosho had managed to buy at some point. The sealed cave was the one that Ken had initially carved out for training, which was designated as the main training hall, the cave being expanded to house more interconnected rooms to accommodate more and more recruits. It had been grueling work for Tosho in the past few months, but he was able to recruit 20 people by the time Ken had gotten there, 10 people more than the last time he had reported to Ken. It was a rather great achievement for Tosho, and he was quite proud of himself as well. Ken also felt his surroundings and sighed with a satisfied smile on his masked face. "You've done a great job, Tosho. It seems you were preparing for a large recruitment drive with all of the homes." Ken finally addressed his retainer and trusted right hand. "Yes, I had first focused on creating the accommodations, only starting recruiting when I felt that the site was ready." Tosho finally raised his head, his masked face looking towards his leader. He immediately started reporting the situation and going into detail about the recruitment process, and what orphanages he had approached and paid to do recruitment in. Orphanages were closed to selling children as slaves in some regions, so gaining recruits was really not difficult when one had the budget. Tosho would have had a lot more of them if he wasn't handpicking only the ones willing to join and grow stronger. Saburo couldn't quite tell what emotions Tosho was displaying, but it was clear that the retainer held a lot of admiration and respect for Ken, a child that was likely not even half his age from the looks of things. It was a rather strange scene, but the strawman couldn't really blame Tosho for respecting and or admiring Ken. Akira didn't really look into things in such a detailed manner. He just continued looking around, seeing the 24 children that were training in the compound. They didn't seem to have noticed the approaching shinobi, all focused on their training, throwing weapons, sparring and even doing regular physical training. Saburo also looked towards them with one of his many pairs of eyes, judging them rather quickly as still fledglings, none even reaching the level of genin currently. It was to be expected of a new organization though. Not many people were as talented and or as determined as Tosho to improve at such an impressive pace. Not only that, even the earliest recruit had only only been training for around 2 months, which wasn't much. From Tosho's reports, it seemed that their only real issue currently was the fact that they were nowhere near being self-sufficient. When it came to food, they had no one to really handle cultivation, so Tosho always had to leave for food, leaving the oldest in charge for days at a time every month. It was not uncommon for him to return, and there to be a recruit less than when he had left. It seemed that leaving orphans unattended on a deserted mountain range was not a good idea after wow. Who would have thought? Alas, the ones that remained at least learned not to wander randomly. So at least that was good still. The children seemed to be in quite high spirits from what Saburo was able to see. All of them were intermingling with each other, creating rivalries and friendships, as they would have inside the academies of the hidden villages. It seemed that Tosho was prepared to recruit at least 3 times as many children, and he had already made accommodations for them. It seemed that Saburo's clones wouldn't have to sleep outside in the dirt. After all, alas, they didn't really need sleep anyway. Only Saburo's main body really needed it. But it did help keep up the facade that they were real people and not puppets. Also, when Saburo was actually asleep, all of the clones would enter a vegetative state as well, as there was no way for him to split his consciousness into so many different bodies while unconscious. It was good for there to be a place where they could hide while Saburo rested. In the end, it was also time for the children/recruits to learn who the leader was. They had always been calling Tosho their teacher and mentor, but they already knew that he wasn't the leader of the organization they had chosen to join. To them, Tosho had given them a chance for a better life, but the one to have made all of it possible was someone they hadn't ever met. In a way, it helped make Ken seem a lot more enigmatic, but actually seeing the blind swordsman in person made them all shudder. All of them stopped training when seeing him walk over. Ken was by no means a tall man yet, but he had a great presence even to most shinobi, so one could only imagine what the children were feeling when he walked into their line of sight. It was a strange feeling for the children. They could all feel that Ken was not normal. It was as if the world itself was telling them that. That filled them all with both blind admiration and fear, especially when seeing dozens of shinobi trailing behind him in rows, including Tosho. Ken scanned the children in front of him. He could feel their fear, their emotions hardly hidden, though some of them did try to keep their emotions in check. Children, they immediately flinched when hearing Ken's raspy voice. Saburo found it rather ironic, as Ken was likely not much older than the recruits. No reason to fear me, I am the last person that will hurt you in this life. All you have to do is not betray me. Ken's voice, despite being rough and raspy, still had a calming cadence to it, managing to relax some of the young boys and girls in front of him. Thank you all for choosing to join us. From this moment on, you are officially part of the Dark Brotherhood. Those who have joined are now family, whether you like it or not. That was all that the leader said, finally announcing the name of the organization to the children, who were rather excited when hearing it. Family, that was a rather powerful word for war-orphaned children. It was something that many of them were tragically denied in that life, but now it was offered to them. They had already started considering each other family, but they didn't know what the future had in store. Officially becoming a family had managed to finally seal the deal for the recruits. Tosho and the rest could see how their motivation became stronger, how the fire burned brighter in their eyes. Saburo simply smiled when seeing that, considering the indictment of the young orphans to be a rather successful endeavor. It does feel good to follow someone competent for a change. I wonder how far he will go. With his talent, I think I will get to climb to the peak in this lifetime. After that, the children continued their training. Their wills were strengthened by their finally seeing their leader and listening to his speech. Now, they could also finally start calling themselves brothers and sisters, something they had longed to do for a long time. As they trained, the rest of the ADULTS and Ken also got to work. Saburo put his tireless clones to work instantly, building a few more houses to have spare storage space just in case. They also voted for Ken to get the largest house for himself, as he was the leader at the end of the day. The leader must get a house befitting his status. With our current budget, even making it out of the most expensive materials would be feasible. Saburo was surprisingly the one to come up with the idea. It was a clear tactic to garner even more respect for Ken, as his position of leader would give him his own housing. However, Ken argued that it could also garner some jealousy from the recruits, though that was quite unlikely with how high their opinion of the blind swordsman had become. Still, Ken simply found the concept rather wasteful. In the end, only his closest retainers were to live with him, each having their own room. By closest retainers, Ken simply meant Tosho, Akira, and Saburo. The newer recruits were not really on the same hierarchical level as Tosho. At least Akira wasn't, but Ken still trusted them enough. Saburo especially became the head of the research department, and Ken promised to build him an underground laboratory in the village after they settled him properly. Then Tosho, Akira, and Saburo all received a task. sorting through everything that Ken had stolen and categorizing their spoils properly. Saburo didn't think much of it at the time, but it seemed that Ken had gathered quite a good amount of resources in quite a few sealing scrolls. This might take a while. The strawman could only sweat when seeing the piles of books and scrolls that lined the table in front of them. Ken wasn't helping them, by the way. Akira tried to complain, but Ken simply waved his palm in front of his eyes and basically told him to fuck off. And that's the end of this episode. The series will continue in the next part, so be sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, share, and comment down below. This really helps with the YouTube algorithm. Thanks for watching, we'll be seeing you in the next part. Check out my other anime videos.